The night opens like an old jar of clay, its scent of dust and memory rising slow. Beneath the wheat fields of Ukraine, there sleeps a circle no one built in living time. The grass bends to a rhythm older than history, tracing outlines that once burned bright, then turned to ash. Archaeologists call it Trypillia, but that is only the name we give to silence. They found its bones through the hum of magnetometers, invisible streets glowing in the soil, coiling around an emptiness that feels almost alive. No walls, no palaces, no kings, only patterns of houses that danced in rings as if the earth itself had whispered. Move together and vanish together. Each century, they burned it all. Homes' idols, grain, even the clay that bore their fingerprints offered to fire like a heartbeat, restarting itself. When the flames died, they built again on the same red floor layer upon layer until the ground became a memory baked in heat. It was a civilization that survived by erasing itself. Who were they, these builders of circles that burned? Why did they choose the rhythm of fire over the comfort of permanence? And when their cities turned to cinders for the last time, did they watch the embers fade? Or did they walk calmly into the glow, believing that something greater was waiting beyond the smoke? Tonight, we will descend into the quiet geometry of their world. We will walk the spiral paths of Majdaneckie, the hollow squares of Nebelivka, the red ruins of Taljanki. We will listen to what the ash still remembers, for beneath each circle, there is always another. The first circle arrives as a hush underfoot, a tremor in the meadow that the wind keeps forgetting. Taljanki lies there, quiet as cooled brick, the fields combed smooth by seasons that do not know its name. When dawn thinly pours over the steppe, every dew bead seems to follow a path that is not visible, curving gently toward a center that no longer exists. If you stop and breathe with the land, you can feel a pressure, the soft insistence of a pattern pressing up from below, as if the ground is a page trying to read itself aloud. They were here between 41 and 36 centuries before the counting of years began. That span is not a distance, but a weather, a long atmosphere of decisions repeated. They learned a choreography of building and undoing, as though permanence would have been a mistake in that climate of meaning. Taljanki was not a town in the way we use the word, with its severed rooms and decisive borders. It was the slow insistence of many hands reaching for a shape that would accept everyone, and a schedule that would set them free. You can picture the houses plaited from willow and daubed with clay, their walls breathing like bread. Some stood in 2 levels, the upper floors warm with stored grain, the lower rooms holding the echo of voices that negotiated with winter. The hearths were modest. The platforms brought the red of fired plaster climbing up the walls like a patient sunrise. Everywhere there were jars bellied for milk and honey and the quiet urgencies of seed. And tucked in corners, a small city of clay faces that were not really faces, smoothed into masks of thought, hips rounded like hills, shoulders sloped as if listening. People call them figurines, a word too small for objects that held entire households in their stillness. They were stroked into being by hands that had baked the floors and lifted the rafters, hands that smelled of chaff and smoke. They do not smile and they do not frown. They wait, set beside the threshold or near the hearth or on a shelf that remembers every autumn. They look outward with the calm of tools that know their work. Perhaps they kept time by the shine of the clay bright when the fire was new dim as the year exhaled. Perhaps they were not gods, but habits, the way a community teaches itself to become one body. In Taljanki, you can imagine market days with no market, only the good friction of neighbours. Grain moved in curved paths, clay passed palm to palm tidings, carried by footprints that never cut straight across the grass. A ring road that was not a road, but a promise round, as a word repeated until all syllables were smooth. Children learned to count by circling the same line of houses until laughter knotted and loosened by tracing the shadow of the sun across the emptiness in the middle where nothing was built and everything gathered. At night, the houses would breathe out warmth and the roofs would hold frost, and above the frost there would be nothing but the patient tilt of stars, indifferent yet somehow intimate, as if the sky had learned their names and they had learned not to ask. The calendar lived within them. It did not need to be carved into stone or stretched across a temple. You could tell the turnings by the ache in the shoulders during threshing, by the direction smoke lay down in wind, by the weight of the oven door when it lifted like a season. Between one harvest and the next, they rehearsed a ritual no one remembers learning. There would be a day known only by its mood when the village agreed to become a fire, not out of panic, and not because enemies stood at the fields, but because the pattern required renewal by ash. The floors were already prepared for heat. The beams knew which way to fall. Grain that had served its thought would hiss and soften, and the figurines would find their next expression in the collapse. The air would darken and then brighten and then quiet, and there would be a red memory left beneath black. For a time they would sleep away from the circle under trees in the wide hush of the plain, as if to listen for the village's new breath. Then they would come back hands full of straw and intentions, and build again over the cooled blush of yesterday. A foundation did not mean a forever, only a good place for the next lesson. A roof did not mean a conclusion, only a held silence where water could be heard arranging itself into words. Children would ask why, and the answer would arrive from many mouths at once, a warm cloud of explanation that did not need to be precise, because the circle is kept by heat, because memory must be baked to keep its shape. Because what we love we return to, and what we return to must be made new. In this turning rhythm, clay became biography. If you hold a shard from Taljanki and tilt it in thin light, you can see a ripple that came from fingers working while someone sang. You can see the pause where the song changed the press of a thumbnail when the oven door demanded attention, the small surrender to a laughing interruption. The figurines carry a similar grammar. Some are all hips and shoulders, a valley and two hills topography you could live in. Some are chess pieces that the earth itself might have moved, not to win anything, but to remember which moves existed. Some have lines incised like little rivers, guiding sight back to the middle, to the part of the body that recognizes warmth and holds it. But the most eloquent object is not an object at all. It is the circle that remains after the house is gone. Stand at the margin of Taljanki in the hour before sunrise, and the field is perfectly ordinary. Then the birds begin as if a hand had turned a dial, and the grass slowly dares a sheen. What was flat grows gently convex, a suggestion of a street unfurling a hinge of space opening, where a door once swung in the thick of every day. You sense doorways facing each other, like old friends who can no longer speak, but still agree about the weather. You sense thresholds aligning into arcs, arcs consenting to become rings, rings confessing to a center too careful to reveal itself to the eye. History asks what they believed, how they governed how many they were, what they ate, whether they fought. The ground answers in textures rather than numbers. It holds the count in its felt geometry, the government in how distance yields to curve the diet, in the comfort of ovens, the conflict in the decision to burn what could have been saved. And yet the ground is generous. Even now, it offers up small faces. When rain insists, it opens a red seam. When the plough points down too far, it releases a scent like old bread when sun finds yesterday under today. There is a tenderness to these city plans that feels like refusal. Refusal to be squared into gridded certainty. Refusal to crown a centre with throne or steeple. Refusal to let a place harden into a single meaning. Everything flows outward and inward at once, along paths that prefer to be walked together. The circle controls nothing and organizes everything. Even the fires obeyed it, moving in waves that left the middle intact, guarding an emptiness that worked like a lung. If you kneel and press your ear to the soil, the sound you hear is not a secret. but an instruction. It is the pulse of a community aligning its private mornings with a public shape, then surrendering that shape to heat so it could begin again. This is why Taljanki still speaks, even after silence has perfected its accent. The message belongs to anyone patient enough to listen without grabbing. Do not hold a house too tightly. Do not ask a ring to end. Do not fear the work of ash. But how do we know the ring was there at all, and not simply a softness in the imagination of those who long for patterns where none exist? How can an absence draw a map? What device lets the earth show its vanished streets without lifting a single spade of dirt? To see the circle, we will need to ask iron to feel what our eyes cannot. We will need a machine that listens to the ground the way the ground once listened to fire. We will step from Taljanki's breath to a field at Majdaneckie and watch lines appear where only grass had been like handwriting, returning to a page that forgot it was written upon. The field at Majdaneckie looks at first like any other piece of earth. Long grass, a few stubborn stones, the echo of wind carrying the scent of damp soil and distance. Yet, beneath that quiet, something hums, not a sound the ear can catch, but a signal the ground keeps repeating to itself. It was John Chapman and Berserker Gaidarska who taught the soil to confess. With magnetometers and drones that never sleep, they traced invisible corridors through the heart of the steppe. The machines did not dig, did not bruise the ground, they only listened. And as they listened, a city unfolded. Houses drawn in rings, each aligned to a center, deliberately left blank, like a pupil waiting for light. Roads bending, not from accident, but from memory. Every pattern curved as though gravity itself had been persuaded to circle. The magnetometry maps look almost like music. Hundreds of tiny pulses marking doorways, hearths, thresholds, intervals between dwellings. A composition scored in black and white, the symphony of a place that chose movement over monument. When archaeologists laid these maps side by side, Majdaneckie Nebelivka Taljanki, the rhythm repeated, each city echoing another like a heartbeat in an enormous organism that once sprawled across the Dniester plain. What they found challenged the chronology of order. At 40 hectares, then 80, then more than 200. These were not villages, but something else, settlements vast enough to hold thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives. Yet there were no fortifications, no citadels, no centers of power. The architecture was circular democratic, in the way a flame is everything touched to the edge of something larger. Every home stood equal to its neighbor. Every path led toward the emptiness at the middle, an emptiness not of absence, but of reverence. Imagine walking through it late in the season of ripening grain, the air heavy with pollen, the roofs whispering with thatch and sparrows. Children dart between thresholds, their laughter winding through the narrow rings, like a tune that knows where it's going, even when you don't. In the open center, women lay clay vessels out to dry, white slip, shimmering against red earth. The patterns of triangles and spirals, glinting with the day's low sun. The shapes repeat, the colors repeat, but never precisely. Every brushstroke says, I remember you, and then I will not be you again. At dusk, smoke lifts from the hearths in synchronized waves, each plume leaning toward the same invisible axis. From above, the air itself would seem to spiral a living map of cooperation. Perhaps this was how they prayed, not through idols or temples, but through alignment, through motion shared by all. Perhaps the pattern itself was their scripture. Night deepens. The fields cool. The sky bends low with stars that have watched since before the notion of beginning. Somewhere, someone adds fuel to a hearth, and the flame answers with a sigh, that delicate agreement between fire and hand. It was always the same pact: to burn is to remember, to rebuild is to continue remembering. Yet the scholars, pragmatic and awake to numbers, hesitate to call Majdaneckie a city. How can a city rise without stone, without hierarchy, without the arrogance of walls? How can it live when its people choose every few generations to turn it deliberately to ash? Still, the data does not lie. Every magnetogram a heartbeat. Every contour of soil a whisper of the same ritual repetition. The settlement breathes like a lung long after its body is gone. It is strange in these places time behaves differently. The earth layers its years not as sediment, but as chapters of intention. Under one floor is another floor, under that another, and then another each. A thin sentence written in ash and rephrased by fire. Archaeologists read downward as monks read scripture. Fingertipped text tracing transitions of colour from grey to red to black. A history written in temperature. A calendar measured by how clay hardens when kissed by flame. Some say the cycle was practical to clear pests, to renew space, to harden the ground for the next generation. Others hear theology in it, an offering of domestic life to the gods of return, a voluntary forgetting so that nothing would own them for too long. Maybe both are true. Maybe belief and necessity are the same word in a language we have forgotten. BCE once said, the magnetometry didn't just map walls, it mapped emotion, how close people built to one another, how they shared breath, how they trusted that proximity would not devour them. You can almost feel it when you stand where her instruments once passed a hush that is not emptiness, but restraint. A choreography of restraint, a culture teaching itself how to vanish gracefully. No written language has survived from Trypillia. Their script was the curve of settlement, the ratio of space between dwellings, the harmony of symmetry undone. To read it, you must think in echoes. To understand it, you must imagine community, not as a line, but as a pulse swelling, releasing, swelling again. In the archives, the magnetograms glow faintly on their screens, rows of black and white dots like stars caught under glass. Scientists measure distances, chart densities, debate demographics. But if you tilt your head and soften your eyes, the images start to move. The houses breathe the corridors, curve the empty center beats, once like a slow drum buried deep. Perhaps it is not data at all, but memory captured mid-dream. Tonight, if you close your eyes and let the hum of the world settle, you might hear it. A rustle of straw, a door of woven reed, sighing in the wind, the low percussion of feet, tracing arcs upon the earth. And beyond that, a low exhalation, the ground remembering itself again. We leave Majdanecka, the way its builders once did gently without closing the circle. Ahead waits another hollow at Nebelivka, larger, emptier, stranger, a place that keeps the silence of a cathedral and the shape of a question. There, the centre holds nothing but the air of 1,000 years. There, the circle opens into a heart so vast that even fire hesitated to cross it. Nebelivka lies farther east, its name drifting through the wind like an afterthought. To the unknowing eye, it is only a gentle hill of grass and whispers. But beneath that calm, a city still breathes 200 hectares of quiet geometry, where circles of clay once glowed red under the slow mercy of fire. They found it, not by digging, but by patience. Aerial scans first, then magnetometry, and then the subtle language of soil colour shifts, micro traces of ash. The ghostly signatures of foundations dissolved by time. Each ring drawn into existence, each dwelling turned slightly to match the unseen order, until the entire plain became a mandala of intention. At the centre, there was nothing. No temple, no tower, no throne, only emptiness vast and deliberate, like the pause between two breaths. Archaeologists called it the plaza, but it feels more like a silence given shape. 1,000 homes faced it, their doorways turned inward, as if every hearth bowed toward the same absence. What lived in that space? Wind, maybe. Songs, drifting over the baked earth, as women crushed grain and men carried clay. Or perhaps it was the meeting ground for everything they could not name, birth weather desire, the long ache of remembering. When storms moved over the horizon, lightning would strike there first, illuminating nothing but dust. And in that flash, the people might have seen themselves part of the pattern, not above it. The soil still holds their rhythm. John Chapman once traced a single street through its layers, finding hearth after hearth built in near-perfect alignment with those beneath. Each new generation following the same curve, the same modest plan, as though memory itself had become architecture. Sometimes when he knelt to sketch a foundation, he found thin white streaks, melted clay, fused by fire so hot it turned to glass. The flames were not accidents. They were ritual precision, a cycle measured by years and by breath, by how the heart must forget in order to begin again. In one trench, they found the remains of a great structure walls, thicker than any house, a floor smoothed like a mirror. It stood alone in the centre, once perhaps as a meeting hall, perhaps as the body of a god who preferred to live horizontally. Scattered around it lay fragments of painted vessels, their spirals dizzy with repetition, their triangles folding into infinity. The pigments red, black, white, the same trinity found on every surviving pot, the same code written across the Trypillian world. When the team reconstructed one of the walls in simulation, they saw that each layer had been burned 3 times, first to harden, then to cleanse, then to surrender. After the 3rd fire, the people left it not broken, not abandoned but complete, an ending they had practiced since the world began. You can almost hear the last burning, the sky, the colour of copper sparks rising like insects, fleeing dusk children watching from the ridge, their faces painted with clay, their mothers silent, not mourning, but remembering the rhythm. When the last beam fell, when the flames folded the roof into a single red sigh, someone must have whispered, "It is ready." Days later, rain came. It hissed against the cooling clay, turning the ashes dark, sealing the memory beneath a new skin of soil. The next morning, they walked the perimeter again, measuring with footsteps, smoothing the land with reeds and song. They laid new posts where old shadows slept. And Nebelivka began, again, its circle slightly wider, its center slightly emptier. From above, through the eyes of drones and satellites, the site now resembles the cross-section of a tree. Each ring another life, each scar another season of flame. But unlike a tree, the growth moves inward, as well the city folding toward its own silence. A spiral not of ambition, but of return. Sometimes I wonder if they understood time differently, not as a line to be conquered, but as a body to be breathed. Their architecture was meditation. Each house a repetition of calm. Each wall a prayer baked into the skin of the earth. No need for monuments, for permanence was never their god. Only rhythm. Only renewal. The soil of Nebelivka is warm even in winter. Farmers say that when the frost comes late, steam rises from the ground in slender threads, as if the city still exhales beneath the plough. Some swear they've heard a soft humming, perhaps water moving through old ovens, perhaps something older remembering. Stand there long enough, and you'll feel it too. A slow pulse underfoot, steady tender, like the echo of hands shaping clay in another century. What kind of faith ends each chapter in fire? What kind of peace allows people to watch their homes burn and smile as the walls collapse into light? Perhaps they believe the soul of a place must be free to live again, that clay cannot remember unless it is broken, that memory, like a circle, only completes when it returns to its beginning. We call it destruction. They called it continuation. And somewhere beneath that sleeping plain, the ashes still glow, waiting for a breath, waiting for the next morning that will build upon their warmth. But before we leave Nebelivka's silence, we must linger with the fire itself, with the choice to burn. Because in that act, in that shimmering surrender, The Trypillians may have written the oldest manual on how to let go. Fire was not a stranger to them. It was a companion, an inheritance, a language written without words. Every generation in Trypillia learned how to read its tone, how the crackle of oak differed from the whisper of straw, how the breath of smoke could tell the hour of day. To burn was not destruction. It was conversation. Archaeologists call it ritual house burning, a phrase that feels too clinical for something so intimate. Imagine standing inside your home walls, polished with white clay hearth, still warm, the scent of grain heavy in the air. You have swept the floor, gathered your tools, whispered to the figurine by the door. Then you light the fire. It begins quietly. The thatch curls a slow, golden trembling. The beams murmur as if remembering every word ever spoken beneath them. Flame travels upward, finding old soot like a road map, finding your fingerprints still pressed into the walls. It does not roar. It sighs, a patient, devouring calm. You watch as the ceiling reddens as smoke folds the air into ribbons. You do not run. You do not weep. For this was never loss. It was release, the returning of clay to dust, the teaching of walls to forget. When Michailo Videco sifted through the ruins of a burned Trypillian house, he found a floor baked hard as stone walls fused into sculptures of colour, white melted into rose, deepened into crimson, cooled to grey. Even the grain stored in clay jars had become glass-like tiny mirrors reflecting the last light that touched them. The house had not perished. It had been perfected. Layer after layer, archaeologists uncover these floors, each one the echo of a fire that once remade the same space. The stratigraphy of devotion, grey, red, black, red again. Each tone a breath in the long exhalation of a civilization that refused to stand still. To live in a circle is to know the value of repetition, to trust that return is not regression, but understanding. Some believe the fire was practical cleansing pests, hardening clay, creating a foundation solid enough for generations to come. Others see it as transcendence, a symbolic cremation of the old self, the home returning to earth, so the people could be reborn. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere between utility and reverence, in that narrow place where necessity touches beauty. Trypillia's genius was to never separate the two. A house was not just a shelter, it was a vessel. When filled with heat, it remembered its birth in flame. When released again, it joined the great rhythm fire, clay, breath, fire again, the same cycle that moves within our own bodies: inhalation, exhalation, renewal. The city breathed as we do. And so every few generations, the people gathered. Neighbours helped neighbours carry embers from one hearth to another. Children held baskets of straw, their laughter a counterpoint to the chanting of the elders. The first spark caught, and in moments the night became a sunrise that no dawn could rival. The sky was painted copper. The earth blushed beneath the heat. In that instant, the city and its people shared one heartbeat. They did not watch from a distance. They stood close, faces shining with warmth, eyes reflecting their own handiwork, dissolving into light. They understood what we have forgotten, that creation is a cycle, not a monument. That fire, when given gently, gives back form. That endings are the only way beginnings can enter. When the flames settled into ash, the villagers scattered handfuls of it into the fields. They mixed the dust of their homes with soil and seed. Every harvest thereafter tasted faintly of memory. Bread carried the warmth of the walls that once sheltered them. Water cooled the same clay that had been flame. Life and home and earth blurred until there was no boundary left to name. Archaeologists, in their clean gloves and cautious tongues, call this phenomenon collective house sacrifice. But it was more than ritual. It was philosophy embodied in architecture. a belief that permanence was an illusion, that memory could not exist without release. The Trypillians practiced impermanence with precision, their cities built not to last, but to teach. Even now, when the sun rises low over Ukraine's plains, the ground glows faintly red where they once burned. In the mist, it almost looks like embers returning. Farmers say the earth there is unusually fertile, as if nourished by centuries of devotion. The same ash that held their homes now holds the roots of wheat and rye. The same pattern persists, disguised as agriculture. We keep feeding ourselves with the remains of what we loved. Maybe that is the quiet inheritance of Trypillia, the wisdom of letting go beautifully. In their circles of fire, they rehearsed what every civilization must one day learn, that everything built by hand will return to dust, and that dust, if treated kindly, will bloom again. Tonight, if you close your eyes, you might see the outline of a doorway glowing softly, the air trembling with warmth, the scent of smoke rising not from fear, but from acceptance. Someone steps through, leaving footprints that turn to sparks, and in the distance, another circle waits to begin. From the ashes of Taljanki and Nebelivka, a new pattern is emerging, a network of trade, of exchange, of invisible roads between rivers. The circles are beginning to connect, and when paths connect, they form something greater, a map of movement, a song the continent once knew by heart. Let us follow that faint vibration toward the rivers that held their reflection toward Cucuteni, where art became language, and language began to forget itself. Between the rivers Dniester and Prut, the earth turns a softer shade of gold. Here, in what we now call Cucuteni, the breath of the Trypillian world rippled outward, spreading through valleys and ridges like paint dissolving in water. It was a frontier without fences, a slow migration of ideas, of pigments, of rituals too delicate to name. Cucuteni was not merely a region, it was a mood of earth. The soil there glowed with iron, and from that glow came a new voice pottery that sang in spirals, motifs that turned and returned upon themselves until geometry became meditation. No script was ever carved, and yet their vessels speak. 1,000 silent sermons delivered through colour and curve. Red for blood, for heat, for the pulse beneath the wrist. Black for soil, for night, for the void that swallows all beginnings. White for air, for bone, for the hush after fire. In those three pigments, they captured everything that matters: birth breath, disappearance. The women who painted these vessels worked with hands accustomed to both grain and flame. They mixed their pigments with ash, their brushes with horsehair and reed. Their patterns repeat the same language seen from the sky rings and spirals lines wrapping around a hollow centre. Every pot is a city in miniature, every bowl a map of the self. The same devotion to the circle, the same invitation to return. When you look close at their designs, you see movement, not of figures, but of thought. A whirlpool of intent, a tide folding in upon itself. Sometimes the spirals meet at a dark dot, the symbol of the void that keeps creation honest. Even beauty needed its shadow. The gossamer difference between the Trypillian and Cucuteni hands is like the pause between inhale and exhale. One built the house, the other painted its echo. One traced fire in clay, the other traced thought in pattern. Together they formed a single civilization that knew how to vanish gracefully, how to leave behind not ruins, but resonances. Among the hills near Poiana Slatine, archaeologists uncovered a spring where brine still seeps from the ground. It smells of time, metallic, ancient, patient. This was where the saltmakers lived, men and women who turned the breath of the earth into crystal. Their fires never rested. Through evaporation and waiting, they extracted the pale dust that kept life possible, preserving food, healing wounds, softening ritual flesh. Salt was the earliest map of connection. From here, the people of Cucuteni carried it north toward the Carpathians, west toward the plains, south toward the Black Sea. Every handful of salt was a conversation with distance. Salt and pottery, two arts of patience. Both required the slow coaxing of a matter, the surrender of speed. Both demanded heat and calm. And both left behind forms that refused to die. Even after 5,000 years, you can still see the shimmer of salt in the soil, the red curl of a painted jar half buried in the riverbank. The Cucuteni artists loved symmetry, but never obedience. Their lines tremble just slightly. Their spirals quiver at the edge of perfection, as if to remind us that flaw is the door through which the divine enters. Each piece holds that tension, the balance between control and surrender, between craft and accident. You can feel it in the weight of a single sherd, how it hums faintly when you hold it to your ear, as if the air inside still remembers the woman who shaped it. Some vessels were too large to be practical. They stood taller than a child, wide as a person's outstretched arms. Perhaps they were not made for storage, but for ceremony, a kind of architecture in clay. When filled with grain or water or light, they turned into living objects, each curve catching the rhythm of footsteps, each pattern reflecting the pulse of song. In the museums of Venezia and Iași, they sit now behind glass, silent, perfect, tamed. Visitors pass whispering about beauty, not realizing that beauty was never the point. These were instruments, not ornaments. Their purpose was sound. When struck by a hand or wind, the jars hum in frequencies that still unsettle the air, a resonance soft and low like memory retelling itself in another language. If you could walk through Cucuteni 5,000 years ago, you might find a village glowing at dusk, hundreds of ovens breathing orange into the sky, children chasing shadows across the packed clay floor, elders humming the day into rest. Each wall carries a faint blush from last season's fire, each threshold marked with the print of bare feet. Inside every home, a pot cools on the hearth, its painted skin shining in the flicker of flame. The pattern twists endlessly, the spiral turning toward its own center. A reminder that even stillness moves. Perhaps this is what the Trypillian world wanted to teach, that civilization does not always shout in stone, that memory does not require marble to persist. Sometimes, the most enduring legacy is a pattern repeated quietly enough that even wind learns to carry it. From these hills, the spiral traveled outward, across rivers and forests, along the hidden roads of trade, through the Dniester valleys and beyond. It would whisper into future ages, into the painted ceramics of the Aegean, into the mythic motifs of Minoan Crete, into the sacred circles of later Europe. Every pattern a distant echo of the first. But before the spiral could reach the sea, the world would tilt. The weather changed. The rivers turned against their beds, and the fire that once renewed began to consume. The last circles would glow one more time, then fall silent beneath the grass. Somewhere beneath Cucuteni's fields, a final pot lies unbroken, its spiral unending its colours, waiting for light. When it is found, the earth will remember how to breathe again. And perhaps, through that breath, we will too. Some stories end with collapse. Others end by sinking quietly back into the rhythm that first made them. The story of Trypillia does both. Beyond the painted vessels of Cucuteni, the circles began to widen their edges, fraying toward the forests, their songs scattering into trade routes that no longer returned. The air grew colder, the summers shorter, and the harvest once generous became hesitant. The rivers swollen with glacial melt shifted their beds and carried whole settlements away. Archaeologists trace this fading in layers of dust. At first, the burn layers continue neat and cyclical evidence of ritual discipline. Then abruptly, the intervals lengthen. The ashes become scattered accidental, mixed with signs of abandonment. Broken pots, left unburied charred beams, fallen out of rhythm. A silence too chaotic to be ceremony. Perhaps the climate betrayed them. Or perhaps it was memory that grew too heavy to hold. What begins as ritual can over time turn into burden, a pattern obeyed more out of fear than devotion. Maybe one generation forgot the meaning of the fire, and the next forgot the reason to rebuild. By 3400 BCE, the great Trypillian circles had dimmed. The largest of them, Meditative, Nebelivka, lay empty but unbroken. No invader came, no massacre, no storm of spears. Only a long, slow exhale. People drifted away, carrying with them a language of clay and fire that would seed the next 1,000 years of myth. John Chapman once wrote, "Trypillia vanished not through violence but through transformation. The soil seems to agree. For beneath those plains, the ash has settled into fertility, so rich that even now wheat rises effortlessly. It is as if the land learned how to remember without needing monuments. And yet something lingered. In caves like Verteba in Podolia, they left their last traces, bones of sheep and oxen, broken jars filled with small figurines. The scent of earth sealed from sunlight for 5 millennia. The cave walls sweat with minerals, their surfaces glimmering like wet skin. When torchlight touches them, the clay faces appear to move their hollow eyes, reflecting the fire that once was. Inside one chamber, archaeologists found a peculiar arrangement. Rows of figurines lined as if attending a silent ritual, some upright, some fallen, each smudged with soot. The pattern repeated the circle, a final echo of cities above. Even underground they could not forget the ring. What was the purpose of these effigies? Were they guardians of memory or passengers preparing for an unseen journey? The Trypillians left no answer. Only gestures, a hand moulded in clay, a face without eyes, a city built to burn. Their faith was never written. It was enacted. They believed not in permanence, but in the grace of return. And return perhaps they did. Centuries later, in the bronze dusk of early Europe, new cultures rose along the same rivers the people of the Carpathians, the makers of megaliths, the dreamers of the sun. They built rings again, not of clay this time, but of stone. Their monuments stood firm, defying the soft impermanence of Trypillia. Yet inside their geometry, you can still feel the echo of that earlier breath. The ring endures, transmuted from fire to granite, from soil to myth, even in faraway lands. Ireland's Newgrange, Britain's Avebury Malta's temples, carved from seabone limestone, the same curve repeats. It is as though a memory migrated without words, a pattern drifting across centuries like pollen. Each circle marks a rhythm, the sun's rise, the moon's descent, the balance between presence and absence. The Trypillian cycle lives on quietly, teaching that time is not a line, but a loop of forgetting and remembering. In the dream language of the night, you can imagine a Trypillian mother standing in the glow of her burning house, watching the clay darken the air shimmer. She turns away, steps into the darkness, carrying a single pot, its spiral still wet, still alive. Her children follow barefoot on the cooling soil, toward the next valley, toward a new beginning they do not yet have words for. The stars above them have not moved. They pulse gently as if keeping time. The wind folds itself around their silence. Somewhere a dog barks once, and the echo seems to travel forever. The next day, another group will arrive at the same blackened field. They will kneel, touch the red ground, and feel its warmth rising faintly. They will smile. They will call it blessed. And once again, hands will gather straw, mix clay, trace new walls upon the ashes. The circle begins again, not out of duty, but because the earth remembers the pattern better than we do. And perhaps that is the quiet miracle of the Trypillian world, that it never truly disappeared. It only changed mediums from architecture to myth, from clay to consciousness. Somewhere deep in our collective sleep, we still dream of round cities that burn themselves awake. When we wake, we call it déjà vu, but it is only the memory of a house we have already built and already burned 1,000 times before. The rivers keep the last reflections. Long after the cities are gone, they carry fragments of clay downstream, a shard here, a figurine's hip there, patterns diluted but not erased. Each flood rearranges the past. Each eddy whispers the same refrain: nothing truly ends, it only drifts. If you follow the Nesta eastward in spring, when the snow melt turns the water to smoke, you might see the soil bloom with colour. Tiny pieces of pottery glint among the reeds, their spirals faint but unbroken. Farmers pick them up absent-mindedly, turn them in their hands, and toss them back into the current. Even in their forgetting, they repeat the ritual of return. Beneath these waters, a different geography begins, one we cannot walk, only imagine. Between the Dniester and the southern Bug lies a landscape shaped not by mountains, but by memory ridges of ancient shorelines, valleys once carved by vanished streams. Here, the Trypillian settlements once formed a constellation of circles, each a point of light in a web of exchange. Grain salt pigments obsidian the veins of a civilization pulsing quietly under the skin of prehistory. Marco Nebbia's maps show this web like a nervous system, a network of radiating paths, soft lines of magnetism connecting site to site. The circles were not isolated. They spoke to one another through trade, through ceremony, through the slow migration of ideas. To walk their distances today is to trace the ghost of that conversation, the long breath of a culture speaking across horizons. And at the heart of this web lies a mystery of direction. All the circles face east, every entrance, every street angled toward the dawn. A collective turning as if the first light itself were the true center. The fire of sunrise and the fire of ritual flame were two sides of the same truth, that renewal comes not from above, but from repetition. At dawn, the people of Trypillia must have stood before their doorways, eyes half closed, faces gilded with that first pale gold of morning. The houses glowed faintly, their clay still warm from yesterday's embers. Smoke curled upward in soft threads, and the entire city exhaled as one. You could hear the rhythm of breath, human architectural cosmic folding into one pulse. In that moment, there was no hierarchy, no division, only circles within circles. A child's laughter echoing off a wall of painted sunbursts. A mother stirring a pot whose spiral matched the path of the stars. A man tracing his shadow's curve across the floor to tell the time. Life itself was ceremony. Each movement a prayer too natural to be called one. Yet, even as they turned toward the light, they were already walking into shadow. The balance of the world was shifting temperatures, lowering rains, retreating north. The soil began to dry and crack the rivers to narrow. In that slow rearrangement, the circle lost its perfect calm. Perhaps that is why the Trypillians turned inward, building larger, more elaborate settlements, as if to hold the world together through geometry. Their final sites, Taljanki, Majdaneckie, Dobrowody, grew to impossible-sized cities without kings or walls, communities held only by rhythm and will. It was beauty against entropy pattern, against the silence that was already advancing. And when the silence won, they did not resist. They dissolved like mist, leaving only the architecture of intention. What remained was not ruin, but residue, the faint magnetic warmth of purpose, lingering in the earth. Even now, when drones scan the fields, their instruments pick up those whispers-thin lines beneath the surface, a logic too old to fade. Technology meets intuition, science kneeling before ghost. We can map their shapes, but we still cannot explain their choice. Why circles? Why fire? Why the patience of repetition? Perhaps they understood what we do not, that the world itself is round and burning, a fragile kiln drifting through night. That to build a city as a circle is to mimic the horizon. That to burn it is to let the horizon breathe. When the last Trypillian settlements fell silent, their pattern did not die, it migrated. In the following centuries, farmers built new villages on the same plains, never knowing what lay beneath. They placed their wells where ancient hearths once glowed their fields over the plazas of the forgotten. Unaware, they continued the same ritual: harvest, rest, return. The circle persists, even in ignorance. Perhaps that is what memory truly is, a pattern that survives its meaning. An echo repeating long after the voice has gone. The earth hums with these forgotten syllables, each furrow in the soil another line of an ancient chant. Sometimes when lightning strikes in these plains, the impact glass forms tiny black droplets, tektites, like tears, frozen mid-fall. Locals find them smooth and warm to the touch. They call them dragonstones. But if you look closely, they are just clay once melted, now cooled, another inheritance from a civilization that taught the world how to turn destruction into art. And so the rivers keep carrying their fragments. The Daniester, the Bug, the Prout, each one a current of remembrance. Their waters shimmer faintly under moonlight, a reflection of what once burned above. Some nights, when the wind is low and the stars look close enough to touch the surface of the river, seems to ripple in slow concentric circles, as if the past were knocking softly from below. If you listen long enough, you will hear it: the faint crackle of a house reborn, the whisper of a city breathing beneath your feet. And you might realize, as the Trypillians once did, that nothing truly ends. It only changes form. The rivers, the circles, the fire, all telling the same quiet truth: to live is to burn gently, to vanish beautifully, to be remembered by the shape you leave in the soil. And when the last ripple fades, a new one begins, always. In the caves of Veteba, the earth speaks differently. It doesn't hum or sing. It breathes slow, deliberate, the pulse of moisture collecting on stone, the sound of a drop finding its reflection after centuries of falling. Inside this darkness, the Trypillian voice lingers not in words, but in arrangement. The archaeologists who first descended into Veteba carried only lamps and caution. They expected bones, perhaps the dead, but what they found was the memory of living. Vessels set carefully against walls, tiny figurines gathered in circles, patterns drawn in soot that resembled constellations. It was as if an entire city had folded itself inward, retreating from light into womb. The air down here feels older than air should feel. You can taste minerals on your tongue, the faint sweetness of limestone and loss. Every echo doubles back as if the cave itself were answering in its own time. This was not a tomb. It was a rehearsal space for rebirth. The figurines in Veteba are smaller than the ones found above ground miniatures of their former selves. Some no larger than a hand, others barely the size of a thumb. Their bodies are abstracted, their features erased as though identity had been purposefully dissolved. They are not gods nor portraits, but gestures, the shape of a thought caught mid-breath. Each one was pressed from the same local clay as the floors of their vanished homes, as if every statue was a fragment of a place longing to return. Their bodies curve slightly, spines bent, arms folded as though listening inward. If you shine a light across them, their shadows on the cave wall merge into a single being, many voices breathing as one. Archaeologists call this the communal figurine deposit. But it feels more like a memory chamber, a subterranean gathering of ancestors, not of blood, but of pattern. Some were found clustered around an empty pot, its interior polished to a mirror by centuries of air. Inside that hollow reflection, you can almost see the last fire still moving. Why bring these small bodies underground? Perhaps the Trypillians, sensing the end of their cycle, carried fragments of themselves into the dark, offering them back to the earth that had once given clay. Perhaps the caves were their libraries, and figurines were the book's pages of silence written in curve and posture. One figurine, found alone near a stalagmite, was coated in a thin layer of white mineral. When cleaned, its surface revealed a spiral etched on the chest, a line circling inward to a single point. It is the same symbol seen on Cucuteni pottery, the same rhythm carved in the soil above. Even underground, the circle persisted. The deeper you go into vertebra, the narrower the tunnels become. Water glistens in cracks, and the air cools into thought. In one chamber, archaeologists discovered footprints fossilized in fine sediment bare feet, small and large as if a family had walked here together and never returned. The prints end abruptly swallowed by a patch of collapsed rock. It is tempting to imagine them walking not to escape, but to arrive, to step into the earth as they once stepped into fire. The Trypillian relationship with earth was not one of conquest. It was intimacy. They trusted the ground to hold their stories. When they buried a pot, it was not disposal. It was conversation. When they walked into caves, it was not fear of the sky. It was faith that darkness could preserve what light could not. Modern excavations in vertebra unearth something stranger still, a human skeleton resting atop layers of figurines. Its arms folded, skull tilted, slightly upward, mouth open, as if speaking. No signs of violence, no ornaments, no coffin. Only the company of clay. Perhaps the last guardian, perhaps the final storyteller, sleeping in the circle of his own creations. The air grows heavy here. Every step feels like walking through thought itself. Drops of water fall at irregular intervals, each one echoing like the heartbeat of the past. In the flicker of torchlight, stalactites resemble melted architecture columns of a city, slowly dreaming itself back into shape. And among them, the figurines glow faintly, the minerals giving them a skin of light. They look alive as if waiting for breath. Some believe these caves inspired later myths, the underworlds of Europe, the hollow hills, where spirits gather the idea that life must ascend before it can rise again. Perhaps every myth of rebirth began here in the hush of vertebra, where people once stood before their small gods of clay and learned the grammar of ending gracefully. If you blow softly in that darkness, the sound rolls away and returns as a whisper, as though the cave itself is breathing back your words. It says, "Everything built upon me will fall into me. Everything that falls will become my breath. I am not your grave. I am your echo." When you step back into daylight, the air feels thinner. The world sharper the sky, too bright to hold so much quiet. And you realize that perhaps the Trypillians were never lost. They merely chose a different form of survival to become part of the landscape, to teach silence how to speak. In that lesson, they succeeded, for even now, 5,000 years later, we still bend close to the ground, listening. The first taste of distance is salt. Before maps and measures, before lines were drawn between valleys, there was only the need for a flavour that keeps life from spoiling. Along the low hills near Poiana Slatine, brine rises from the earth like a buried breath patient and metallic. It gathers in shallow pans, shines like glass, and waits for fire. Here people learn to carry the sea without water. Imagine the camp beside the spring. Fires steady as stars clay. Pans set upon frames of willow steam, collecting in the morning air. Women lift the brine and pour it again and again until light crusts the rim like frost that refuses to melt. Children hold the first crystals up to the sun, their edges catching the day as if it were a blade to be tested. Salt flakes, pale and translucent, cool on the tongue, sharp as a promise. What they made in that quiet became the beginning of a road. The road has no paving. It moves through memory from one circle to the next. Hands pass a measure of salt, another of pigment, an obsidian blade dark as rain, and the transaction dissolves back into conversation. Distance is counted, not in steps but in favours carried forward. A jar of brine traded for a coil of red slip. A bundle of flax for a sherd, whose spiral means you are expected tomorrow. The Trypillian world tied itself together with objects that asked to be touched. Obsidian arrives in their houses like drops of night. Its edges are unreasonable, perfect and perishable at once, a cut that remembers the hand that struck it from the glassy heart of a mountain. Carpathian veins sent this stone outward, along river bends, through willow breaks, across flats where the wind speaks first. To hold it near a fire is to watch shadow melt. To fix it into a handle wrapped with deer sinew is to anchor a tool to breath. Some blades were used until their light thinned from sharpening. Others slept beside figurines untouched, a dark grammar in a room made of clay. The exchange did not require markets. It required thresholds. At the edge of each ring, where a path widened long enough for two people to stand and do nothing in particular trade, became hospitality. A guest's name was the thing they had brought. A host's reply was a pattern laid in clay with a fingertip left to dry. These were contracts that asked to be broken and renewed the law of return, written into every object moving between rivers. From above, the web looked simple Dniester to bug ridge, to hollow circle, to circle. On the ground, it felt like breathing. There would have been days when a runner moved ahead to tell of distant visitors, of jars arriving with a particular smell of the spring in them, of pigment packets tied with grass fibres, red dust that left its echo on every palm it touched. There would have been nights when the path itself seemed to glow with breath, as if the air remembered each step long after it had faded. Salt makes memory obedient. Meat lasts. Cheese travels. Ceremony can happen later after the season turns, when everyone who must be there has arrived. The plain learns to hold its gatherings not in a rush, but in a circle of patience. A city is not an address. It is a promise repeated until the horizon agrees to meet you halfway. In the quiet grammar of their settlements, gates repeat this promise. Not gates of timber and threat, but widening soft entries, oriented east mouths opening to light. At dawn, the first beams thread those passages, drawing straight fingers across curved streets, waking ovens, with a colour that resembles thought. To enter was to be a lined body, to sunlight footfall to memory. No one needed to instruct. The city taught with shadows. Archaeologists measure these widenings with tape and drone, with the incremental persuasion of trenches that behave like questions. They find a rhythm entrances repeating at intervals that suggest more than convenience. Perhaps each gate corresponded to a kin group, a cluster of households rotating responsibilities the way one rotates breath, who tended the spring, who carried embers, who kept the story of how a house ought to fall. Perhaps the alignment to east was both calendar and kindness, a way to bind strangers to the same quiet astonishment at daybreak. A trader arrives at such a gate. He has walked since moonset, and his shoulders ache with the particular joy of long travel. His pack is a small museum, a grey salt loaf tied in hide obsidian wrapped in woven bark. Two figurines with shoulders like hills, a slip-painted bowl whose spiral narrows until it almost becomes a point. At the edge of the circle, a child waits with the dignity of one who has been sent. She leads him along a curve that grows familiar as breath, past ovens whose smoke tastes of millet, past doorways where low conversation stitches morning into the shape of a day. At the centre, nothing waits but wind. They stand there for a moment with the others, and each object in the pack becomes quiet, as if listening. There are words of coarse, haggling laughter, the soft groan that is half greeting and half complaint at how the road has lengthened since last summer. But the trade is already complete the instant they enter the ring. The city has taken their distance and folded it into its own pulse. Salt shifts hands, obsidian finds a new sheath. Pigment dusts the air red where someone tests it with a finger. Later, a figurine will lean into a corner that did not know it was incomplete. Later still, a pot will be placed near the door so the first light has something to read. It is possible to see in this the skeleton of economy. Numbers could grip these exchanges and weigh them into charts, could enlist the past into our addiction to measure. But the Trypillian web refuses to be only efficient. It insists on tenderness. Its roots braid like hair. Its pauses are as vital as its motion. You do not so much deliver to a circle as rejoin it, and what you return with is not a profit but a renewed capacity to stay. At the spring of Poianus Latinae, the fires never learned haste. Even as winters bit deeper and summers arrived late, the brine kept mingling with air in a patience that feels almost sentient. A woman sits beside a pan, watching a skin gather on the surface. She lifts it with a reed and lays it on bark to dry, and in that small act, you can hear the philosophy of the plain extract. Slowly return, gently taste everything. When the loaf is hard enough to travel, she presses her thumb into one side, a spiral shallow and direct. A road in miniature. A memory hardening to be carried away. The proof of connection is not the artifact, but the habit it recalls. Years after the circles fell quiet, the ridges still remember to gather mist. The hollows still organize wind. Planting patterns echo old streets. The first furrow curves by reflex. A farmer stands where a gate once yawned to the light and feels without knowing why a mild reluctance to build straight. His child walks the long way around to the well and cannot explain the joy of arriving by arc. Inheritance disguised as preference. When modern field teams spread their grids, the instruments answer with gentle insistence. Lines rise on the screen, faint at first, then confident, connecting ring to ring across miles of grass. What looks like data is actually longing made visible. The earth is trying to say the same thing. It told the salt makers and the traders come in. Slowly leave with grace, let the center be empty enough for everyone. And so, the road continues. From brine to loaf, from loaf to hand, from hand to hearth, from black glass to blade, from blade to memory, from memory to myth. The network breathes loosening and tightening like a net cast, not to catch but to remind the sea of its shape. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, another circle waits with its east-facing mouth. Another plaza holds its careful vacancy. Another oven declares that fire is ready to be trusted again. We think of civilization as weight stone upon stone, rule upon rule. Trypillia thought of it as light carried well, a mineral that can be portioned by taste, a glass flake that can be sharpened by patience, a pattern that can be taught by walking. And when the pattern can no longer be held, it is placed tenderly back into the ground, where water and time do their soft, erasing work. Ahead, the gates widen into questions. East opens to a sky that remembers every beginning. There is another settlement over the horizon, larger stranger, its rings as disciplined as breath. To enter it, we will need to think like a shadow to learn how thresholds teach the body to move. We will need to stand where day begins and let the city arrange our steps until we are for a while part of its memory. A city teaches by how it opens. The first lesson at the edge of a Trypillian ring is how to slow down. There is no wall to command fear, no tower to cast a shadow of obedience. Only a widening in the path that behaves like a breath drawn gently in. You step from grass to packed clay, and the ground answers with its own calm, a faint echo that tells your feet they have been expected. Every entrance faces east. At dawn, the light threads the threshold like a needle, drawing a straight line across curved streets, stitching house to house with a motion that cannot be argued. You do not need a priest to tell you where to stand. Your body aligns because light insists and the city agrees. Children discover this long before language. Their games begin in the east, swirl toward the middle, and end wherever laughter runs out of breath. The gates teach the second lesson how to share space without asking who owns it. Two people can pass side by side, exchange a jar, a word, a shrug, then dissolve into separate arcs without breaking the rhythm of the whole. Hospitality is built into geometry. The city does not force encounter. It invites it the way a river invites stones to arrange its voice. From there, The streets curl inward, each lane a soft sentence leading toward the plaza that refuses to become anything but air. On mornings of clear weather, the plaza holds a brightness that feels almost edible. Women carry vessels there to drink the light before filling them with grain. Men test new blades by shaving slivers from willow rods, the curls falling like pale handwriting at their feet. Someone unrolls a length of flax and combs it with a bone tool while the dawn warms their knuckles. Nothing is hurried. Nothing is postponed. A Trypillian doorway is low enough to make you bow. Every visit begins as a small act of reverence, even if you have come only to borrow embers or to ask how thick the porridge should be tonight. Inside the house is a held breath. The floor remembers fire and answers with a firmness that is more than strength. It is trust. Walls of woven willow, daubed with clay the colour of rain-held soil, hold the scent of smoke and fermented milk. Ovens sit where conversation thickens their bellies white with ash. On the upper floor, jars squat like quiet animals, round and patient, their painted spirals dim in the half-light. Some houses lean toward 2 stories the staircase, a thoughtful compromise between vertical and curve. The railing is polished by years of palms, a gloss left not by oil, but by repetition, the most honest polish there is. Near the stair foot, a figurine watches hips, rounded shoulders, sloped face, smoothed to a memory of a face. Set at the threshold's edge, it is less guardian than witness. Visitors pass it and become careful without meaning to. Archaeologists will one day measure these rooms by the meter, and the kilogram will tally loom, weights count oven fragments, estimate temperatures from the blush of melted clay. They will be right to do so. Numbers are a kind of tenderness. But the house's own measure is simpler. How long a voice can travel before it stops being someone and starts being everyone. In a good room, the voice makes it to the oven and back. Between houses, distance behaves like kindness. No boundary is hard. Every separation is negotiated by curve and habit. A neighbour's mistake in the night, a dropped jar, a door left open, slides into the city's rhythm and is forgotten by morning. The ring knows how to metabolize accident. It takes in the unmeasured, gives back coherence. On days of gathering, thresholds become instruments. People stand at their doors and tilt jars toward the light. The red-black-white patterns wake and move, triangles leaning into spirals, spirals collapsing to that tiny dot at the center where meaning rests. A piece of obsidian flashes the way a fish's flank flashes briefly. Precisely then, it is only stone again. A child is given salt and told to taste the morning. She closes her eyes and nods solemnly, the way children do when they have been invited into the conspiracy of life. In the ring's outer ambulatory, that broad shared corridor, where feet have taught clay to become smooth, the city remembers to be one body. You can hear it in the synchronized sigh of doors opening at first light. You can see it in the way smoke joins itself overhead, thin threads plaiting into a single ribbon that wanders toward the horizon and disappears. Every circle holds a few dark corners, places where the ground seems to think harder than elsewhere. At midday, when the plaza brightens to the point of tenderness, shadows in those corners sharpen. Men repair axe hafts there, whispering with the seriousness of people who know that wood understands tone. Women set aside one vessel in those shadows, the pot with the spiral that tightens until it nearly becomes a point, an almost. The almost acts as an instruction, leaves something unfinished, so return remains possible. The orientation to east is more than ceremony. It is calendar. A door's shadow crosses a mark on the floor at the same time each season. When it misses you, so earlier or later by a hand's width. On equinox mornings, the first light floods straight through 2 facing thresholds and kisses the plaza's dust until it glitters, a subtle spectacle enough to convince even the skeptical that geometry is a way to speak with sky. No one calls it worship. No one needs to. Processions happen without decree. The ring knows how to walk itself. At dusk, people drift along the outer curve, pausing where conversation pools, letting the city unwind their day like thread from a distaff. Footsteps wear a faint groove that catches moonlight, a necklace laid on the ground. Children count laps by breath. Elders count by stories completed. Some nights someone hums a tune with no words, and the circle answers as if streets could remember melody. Governance is not a word they would have recognized, yet decisions are made and kept. If the ovens need repairing, if the next burn is nearing, if trade must be sent to the salt spring, these facts gather in the plaza the way a storm gathers slowly, inevitably with a feeling that the air has already decided. When the moment comes, no voice raises above the others. Agreement is a temperature reached together. Every few seasons, a house is closed, not burned, yet simply allowed to sleep. Its door is sealed with clay, a spiral drawn with a fingertip in the wet. Inside, a jar remains half full, a figurine tilts slightly toward the room's heart. A folded mat keeps the ghost of a body's weight. Time is admitted and asked to behave. Then the fire. Not tonight, not even this year, but the ring breathes toward it. Beams are chosen with an eye toward how they will fall. Flaws are repaired with the knowledge of how heat moves beneath a life. When it arrives, it will be ready to teach and to be taught once more. The city's acoustics are gentle. Stand at a gate and speak, and someone near the plaza will hear not your words, but your intent carried on the curve. Stand at the plaza and whisper, and thresholds along the eastern lane will shift their attention by a degree that only the attentive notice. It is a place calibrated for cooperation, where sound and light and movement conspire to select the middle way again and again. What of strangers? The circle has a protocol even for them. A newcomer waits at the eastern widening until a child arrives. It is always a child emissary of curiosity. The child leads a path that is both obvious and surprising, a long arc that shows everything without heading anywhere it should not. By the time the newcomer reaches the plaza, the city has decided whether to hold or to release. Most are held. Trypillia prefers addition to subtraction. If you ask why the plan is round and not square, the ground shrugs in a language you can feel under your feet. Squares gather power. Circles distribute it. Squares stop. Circles continue. A square asks who is at the center. A circle asks what emptiness requires. The answer arrives as shade in summer and as the slow staging of dawn in winter. Honest replies that need no translation. A last lesson remains taught at evening when ovens throb and sparrows settle along the roof lines like notes finding their staff. Watch the light recede along the eastern lane. See how the doorposts collect it and then release it pillar by pillar until dark is evenly shared. The city has arranged even the leaving of day to be fair. Beyond this ring, another waits larger and more intricate. Its magnetogram, a lace of thresholds, and pauses its plaza, a lung big enough to breathe an entire season at once. To reach it, we will follow the groove of feet that learn to think in arcs, the old corridor where conversation travels faster than road. We will walk in at sunrise, because there is in cities like these no other honest way to begin. Maps are supposed to be made of lines and legends, a stern grammar that tames land into instruction. The maps of Trypillian cities refuse sternness. They bloom. On a screen in a dim field tent, Majdanetska and Taljanki and Nebelivka open like nocturnal flowers, white pulses on black loops and crescents corridors that refuse to end. You can watch them appear sweep by sweep as the magnetometer drifts across the grass, its quiet instrument heart tugged by iron ghosts in the soil. Each sweep is a breath. Each breath is a house. When the passes overlap, the city exhales, and suddenly you are inside a geometry that understands you better than you understand it. Archaeologists lean close fingers, hovering, not touching. Someone traces an arc and says softly, "Doorway." Another taps a cluster of bright marks and murmurs, "Oven." A paler band pathway, well-worn clay, polished by feet until it learned to be smooth. At the center, a darkness almost uniform, a silence that even the machine respects. The plaza always returns like a memory you cannot misplace. The image looks like a constellation, but it is the opposite. Stars are cold distances. This is density. A warm crowd of particulars agreeing to be one thing. Beyond the tent wall, the real field goes on as ordinary as ever. Thistles and wind, the occasional startled vole. Inside, 2 times collide the day's weather and a settlement of 5,000 years ago humming on the glass. The archaeologist reaches for a pencil, and the pencil hesitates a moment, as if it too should bow before entering. On the edge of the map, someone writes a date, an instrument serial number, a trench code. These details are a courtesy to the future. The map will survive without them. It knows what it is. Look long enough and you begin to sense that the plan teaches ethics. Houses are spaced at distances that feel like sentences, with good punctuation, enough room to breathe, not enough to forget what is being said. The lanes bend so gently that you cannot hurry without noticing you are trying to. Corners refuse to sharpen into ambush. The city erases the opportunity for cruelty by never offering the angles where it prospers. In summer, when teams open small windows into the plan, the sections reveal the physics of devotion. Beneath a layer of topsoil lies a powdery stratum, the colour of old parchment, trampled yard sun, and rain kneading dust into memory. Then a red band, thin at the edges, thick in the middle, a floor baked until it turned to something between ceramic and earth pores closed by heat, a man-made bedrock for stories. Above that, a collapsed horizon, a rack of beam and daub, slumped the way sleep slumps a body, all its intentions softened into grace. Then sometimes the whole sequence repeats. Another floor, another red, another surrender. A house is not a one-time event. It is a phrase practiced until it says itself. Daub is a modest miracle. Wattle first willow rods interlaced like a basket that has decided to stand upright. Then clay mixed with chopped straw chaff, a handful of dung, a measure of patience, smeared with palms until no light shows through, seamed with fingers the way rivers seam deltas. When fired by ordinary life, it warms and breathes. When embraced fully by ritual flame, it vitrifies at the edges, glaze sneaking in where smoke licks most lovingly. Afterward, shards of wall keep their soft sheen, the imprint of thatch and thumb preserved, a ledger of gestures legible to any hand that has ever made anything. Ovens are the house's heart and metronome. Not large, a person could embrace one, and sometimes must on nights when snow rehearses its old authority. Their floors redden deepest, their domes incense the rafters with a sweetness of grain and ash. When excavated, long after their mouths are still confident lips of clay parted, as if to offer advice. You can tell a careful household by the way calcined seed husks line the oven's flank, by the evenness of soot, by the disciplined scatter of broken pots, too loved to discard without ceremony, and always the figurines. They arrive from the soil in postures of listening, armless, faceless, all hip and thought. One stands on a small plinth, impressed with a spiral, the curve so shallow, it is more instruction than sign. Another is pierced at the shoulders, as if once worn a house's amulet, domestic divinity without biography. Set back into the light, they do not regain expressions. Their purpose was never to display. It was to gather attention like a bowl gathers water. Held quietly, they teach the hand to slow. How did a place this gentle decide to burn itself on purpose? stand in a half-excavated room, and the answer moves through you as temperature. The red floor is cool under cloud, warm a heartbeat faster once sun appears. Heat remembers where it belongs. A ritual burning is not chaos. It is choreography. Openings are blocked at the last thatch is fed from within. Beams are not cut but encouraged, their dying direction rehearsed by years of wait. Grain meant for seed is removed. Grain meant for offering is not. A ladder is set to become a line, a pot to become a mouth of glass. Ash will map the plan from above, printing the house back onto itself in negative. In the morning, someone will scoop that ash with care and pour it where next year's barley will ask for story. People sometimes speak of administration, of how such large settlements must have had calendars and quotas rosters for the carrying of water and the gathering of clay. The map provides a different governance. Consent is embedded in the plan. A path that passes too close to a neighbour's oven widens shyly of its own accord. A shortcut tempts, then curves into legitimacy. If a festival is due, the emptiness at the centre begins to exert a pressure, a gravitational hush, and the city answers by drifting there in the cool of evening without summons. Someone brings a drum. Someone else brings silence. Both are accepted as necessary instruments. Night maps the ring again in another register. Hearth by hearth embers declare their soft crimson. From above, from the point of view of an owl's say, or a god that refuses to be anything but patient, the settlement becomes a slow constellation, its light not sharp like stars, but warm domestic carnation at the edges. Smoke writes cursive against the low sky. If the season is the right one, a few roofs away, a closed house waits door sealed with clay, the finger-drawn spiral drying to a pale scar. No one stares at it. Attention would be a kind of noise. When its evening arrives, the ring will know without being told. The magnetogram's beauty tempts metaphor, but it also sharpens questions. What is a city that refuses vertical pride? What is memory that prefers to be baked thin and stacked rather than carved thick and raised? What politics emerges where no corner allows a speech to dominate, where sound must travel in curves that soften before they can injure? The answers are not in words, but in where thresholds, polished by uncounted hips and shoulders lanes, that have learned the gait of thousands plazas that still hold the shape of gatherings inside their dust. Sometimes the instrument falters, where modern disturbance has chewed the past tractor ruts a buried cable. The map stutters, the bloom dims, and yet enough sings through. The city insists on being legible even with holes in its throat. You realise then that survival can mean remaining partially knowable. A whole story would be a cage. A luminous outline is a kindness. At dawn, the tent flies open and the day's air rushes in, smelling of nettle and river. The screen dims, then brightens its constellations unchanged. Field notes are folded. Batteries changed coffee, considered laughter permitted. Outside, the ground accepts another day of being itself. Inside the map holds the ring in a suspension that feels like prayer. Soon, the flags will march in lines across the meadow. Transects will align with patience, and the city will give up a little more of its reluctance to be remembered. Not too much, just enough to keep the conversation true. Before we go on, put your palm to the earth. Feel the faint chill where red floor sleeps under grass. That coolness is a page. Your hand is a word. The sentence will not be finished until evening, when swallows thread the plaza and ovens test the colour of night. By then we will have followed the curve far enough to ask a dangerous kindness of the past to tell us how to end things well. The ring has an answer prepared, taught by ash and east, and the refusal to harden leave room, leave warmth, leave quietly. Endings are where a city shows its character. Most places cling. Trypillian rings rehearse. They pace their exits the way a careful hand paces a line of paint steady, returning to breathe before the curve resumes. By the time a house stands ready to be given to flame, the decision no longer belongs to anyone. It belongs to the pattern. The first sign arrives as courtesy. A door is sealed with wet clay. Not slammed, not barred, sealed the gesture slow enough to be witnessed. Across the lintel, a fingertip draws a spiral that narrows, but never closes, a promise left ajar. Neighbours pass and lower their voices, not from taboo, but in respect for the room's new work becoming ash. Inside, the withdrawal is tender. Walls are smoothed, the last soot coaxed into quiet. A pot is left, with a measure of grain, not enough to be waste, not so little as to be insult. A figurine rests where conversations once collected. A shoulder faces the oven, as if listening for the memory of heat. Beams are checked for honest surrender. A ladder leans where it will fall, like a punctuation mark you can feel. Nights before the burning, the house dreams in a way its people can sense. Voices, lower footsteps hesitate. Even dogs decide to keep the east-facing lane clear. Children ask questions in whispers. Why must we burn what keeps the rain off? Why must we make red what already holds us? Answers arrive like weather. Because fire remembers better than we do. Because a thing that is given back can be received again. Because the circle breathes this way. On the morning chosen by agreement that feels older than speech, the ring gathers without summoning. The plaza brightens to ceremony and then calms as if light itself has bowed. A small procession breaks from the crowd, two carrying embers in a clay bowl, one with straw to teach the flame manners, one with water to remind it of its edges. The sealed door glows from breath alone. When the clay has dried just enough to take a mark without smearing, the spiral is touched once more and the first ember laid at the oven's mouth. Fire arrives like a good listener. It finds the room's grammar and speaks in it. Thatch murmurs, beams negotiate walls. Flush rows along their ribs. The oven exudes a note so low it might be remembered more by the chest than the ear. No one shouts. No one pleads. There is work to do, not rescue, not judgment, only accompaniment. Water hisses at thresholds so the fire will keep to its sentence. Children are shown where to stand to see without wanting. Elders measure with eyes trained by seasons now. Enough. Let it finish itself. What happens at the height of heat is not spectacle, but comprehension. Clay learns its second nature pause, closing colours, deepening edges, remembering the hand. Sometimes the surface blooms with glaze where smoke licks most faithfully a shining that does not brag. Grain meant for offering seethes and collapses into a glass that holds the last shape of breath. You cannot look for long. Gratitude is bright and private. Then the fall, a beam, as rehearsed bows to a wall and becomes a line. Roofskin folds with the relieved sigh of a task completed. A final rush through the oven's throat, like a story finishing on time. After that, a quiet, so complete you can hear the shift from ash to air. Someone says, "Thank you not to the gods, not to luck, but to the room." The word disperses without needing to be heard. The ring departs in gentle halves. Some stay to keep watch to guard against gusts that do not know the ritual. Some walk the outer lane, letting talk pull heat out of their bodies until the world resumes its ordinary temperature. Toward evening, they return. The door is still sealed, but now it is brittle as sugar. A palm pressed to it leaves an imprint that looks like a fossil of kindness. Days later, the work of learning begins. A narrow trench is cut through the ash, not to collect things, but to read. This is a literacy of temperature. A red floor presents itself unwarped, a strength that will lend its calm to the next life. Here is the corner where the pot's mouth became glass. Here, the ladder wrote its last line. Here, the figurine learned to lean into light, even as the roof leaned away. These are not trophies. They are footnotes. The text is the room now transformed. Ash is gathered the way one gathers advice. Part is saved for fields that need to remember rain. Part is worked into new daub, so the next wall will include the grammar of the prior one. Part is scattered at the eastern gate, a small bright drift that souls will carry as pale dust wherever the ring requires attention. Thus, even walking becomes a ceremony of continuity. Soon, the new plan is traced on the red. It rarely copies, it replies. A threshold shifts by a breath's width to invite a different morning's path. The oven rotates slightly to teach smoke another sentence. Jars will stand where echoes test their harmony best. The figurine will wait again near the stair, a small geography of hips and patience. From a distance, this looks like destruction domesticated. Closer, it is devotion with standards. The house is not a possession. It is a chapter in a book the settlement writes together. When your chapter closes, you do not clutch the page. You smooth it and begin the next with ink still warm. The largest rings adopt the same ethic at scale. When the time comes for a quarter of the settlement to sleep, gates learn new manners. The eastern widening of one lane takes on the welcome of three. Food moves in arcs that feel like generosity mapped. No proclamation is needed. The plaza's pressure changes slightly, a weather of intention. And everyone shifts a step to the left without thinking. There are safeguards against vanity. If a house gleams too brightly from careful firing, neighbors teach it humility with laughter and errands. If a family tries to linger past the gentle deadline of memory, the ring provides errands that lead their feet outward, a trip to the salt spring, a delivery of obsidian, a visit to a cousin whose oven needs advice. Return happens as easily as departure. No one is exiled. Everyone is invited to practice elsewhere for a while. Not everything obeys. There are years when rain forgets, when pests learn to read the same calendar, when wood decides to split before understanding. The pattern is lenient. A house may burn early and be forgiven. Another may wait late and be taught by a wind that has not learned the story. Even then, the ring absorbs variance, the way the ear absorbs a missed note in a melody it loves. The end of a settlement is the one ending not rehearsed, and even that tries to behave. Intervals lengthen, burns thin out plazas, hold more sky than laughter. Paths to gates grow generous with grass. One winter, there are fewer ovens at dusk. One spring, voices carry farther, because there are fewer to interrupt them. Someone says perhaps. Someone else says after the harvest. After the harvest, the earth says it for them. When they leave, it is not a march. It is a drift. Weights are chosen with an eye for walkability, not sentiment. Painted jars that want to be stories choose to stay and become shards that will teach. Figurines travel light, unafraid, placed in bags where they can overhear the new plan being born. Gates see them off with the same quiet as welcome. The east receives them once more. What remains is not ruin, but instruction. Red floors cooling under grass. Plazas that still keep the secret of how many voices fit without complaint. Lanes that curve though nothing asks them to anymore. At night, owls find the old ring because mice still remember where the ovens were. The city retires into usefulness. Centuries later, a plough catches on something that rings. A shard rises its spiral, still confident, its edges teaching the hand to be gentler. A child holds it to the sun and squints and sees not ornament but practice. The piece returns to the field or goes to a shelf or to a pocket that will carry it to another pocket, and so on, until a museum arrives. Wherever it rests, it keeps doing its small work, turning permanence into regard. We confuse endurance with height. Trypillia confuse neither. It taught that a place can endure by learning to end well with heat, with fairness, with an emptiness generous enough to be shared. It taught that the East is not a direction, but a permission. That ash is not a verdict, but a medium. That endings are less about stopping than about leaving warmth where the next hand will reach. When the last ember cools, the ring is not gone. It is merely the world again, arranged to remember. Stand at the gate at dawn, where the air tastes faintly of salt and old flour. Close your eyes. A breeze learns your name and uses it carefully. Somewhere, a bird corrects a note, and the plaza accepts the revision. Open your eyes. The curve is waiting patient as bread under cloth, ready to rise as soon as you touch it. Every city has a voice. Trypillian circles have a pulse. If you wake before the east is fully awake, you can hear it assemble itself from small pieces. Whisk of flax against a comb. The breathy thump of a hand against a drumhead. The soft insistence of a millstone turning grain into brightness. Sound collects along the lanes as dew collects on grass. By the time light lays its first straight ribbon through the eastern gate, the settlement is tuned. The day begins with thread. Near the doorway where the first warmth gathers, a woman turns a spindle whirl, and the air learns to spiral along with it. Flax pulls down from her fingers, like thought discovering its path. A loom waits simple as rain, its upright posts smelling of willow. Between them, warp threads stand like a quiet crowd. The weft arrives as kindness going back and forth until the room softens. A child counts the passes. Loses count, begins again, smiles because rhythm forgives. Textiles seldom survive 5,000 years, but their tools do. Loom weights sleep in the soil, like patient fruit, each one still cool to the touch when it comes back into the light. Spindle whirls keep their balance, a geometry so honest that even broken they want to turn. Hold one and you feel what the city felt. Not haste, not delay, but a speed that understands breath. Cloth is the settlement's second skin. A well-woven wall hanging teaches the room to keep its own weather. Bread follows thread. A quernstone circles beneath a steady hand, the stone's low purr blending with the house's older hum. Grain is practical piety. Emma einkorn barley each, a different texture of patience in the palm. From the oven's mouth comes that first proof of day, a sweetness that has learned the shape of fire and remembers it gratefully. Someone breaks a loaf and touches its warm interior to the threshold stone so that even the doorway will carry taste. Crumbs on the floor are not disorder. They are a statement of faith in return. The plaza is not empty. It is unworried. By mid-morning, it hosts errands that don't believe in rush repair, of a haft exchange of a jar, a lesson in knotting that becomes a story without announcing itself. A drum appears, its skin taut with weather and time. The person who carries it never calls for silence. Silence arrives by consent, landing like a bird that trusts the hand. When the first strokes come, they are small, a heartbeat stretched across open ground until feet remember where to go. Children practice procession the way water practices stream, by moving around obstacles until obstacle becomes choreography. They track the shadow of a post, then its absence, learning the calendar from light that refuses to talk down to them. At equinox, 2 doorways across the ring share a beam so clean it looks like decision. Someone laughs under their breath, that laugh people reserve for the instant when geometry and grace admit they were one thing all along. By noon, the circle has found its middle distance. Not crowded, not thin. Voices travel as far as care requires and no farther. A stranger arrives at the eastern widening and the ring does not bristle. A child appears as protocol demands and escort becomes orientation, not inspection. A jar changes hands with a word that does not need to survive the moment. Obsidian flashes once the correct number of times, and vanishes back into utility night stabilized to a cutting edge by sinew and intent. There is little evidence for war, which may be the strongest evidence of governance. Fortifications do not appear on the magnetograms. Corners that would serve ambush are spent on generosity. If conflict came, it had to learn the curve first, and most troubles tire of learning. Power here lacks places to rest. The plan keeps redistributing it until force mistakes itself for weather and passes. Afternoons belong to making and mending. A boy learns to set a post plumb by listening to how the earth receives it. A girl learns to thick and slip with a patience that feels like a secret. Red, black, white, the discipline of a limited palette accepted as a blessing. A pot spiral is not decoration. It is instruction to the hand that will hold it later. Grip here, release here. Remember the center without touching it. When the pot is set to dry in the plaza, shadows move across its skin, and you can watch the design slowly learn to breathe. Some houses keep a second floor where cold obeys. Up there jars shoulder close in a choir of roundness. You can smell last year's apples this morning's straw, the shy sharpness of salt cut from a loaf at Poiana Slatine and carried back in a woven sling. Someone opens a vessel just long enough to let the air understand what has been kept for it. Lids go back on with the finality of a kind sentence. Under the eaves, birds make a treaty with the settlement. Sparrows enroll in the city's school of thresholds, teaching children to measure distance by how a wing decides. At dusk, swallows correct the day's arithmetic, a flicker writing along the ring. No one feeds them formally. The agreement predates manners. When a roof is due to burn, birds arrive a little less often the week before. As if warned by a grammar of heat, they read better than we do. Evening is the hour when decisions ripen. Not decrees, those are for towers and echoes and a different kind of memory. Here choices coalesce where feet already trend. If a burn will happen within the season, if a path should widen to admit a wagon of clay, if a cousin's oven needs more attention than pride, currently allows these truths gather in voices that never need a leader. Agreement is the temperature a room reaches when enough small fires are steady. Later, music finds its shape without permission. A flute whispers a line it learned from wind passing through reeds at the river's bend. A drum answers with a measure that respects the plaza's patience. Someone braids stems of last week's harvest into a ring and sets it where the light will be tomorrow, the way one reserves a seat for dawn. Children fevered by day grow suddenly solemn, recognizing the ceremony in how adults lower their eyes when nothing is wrong. Night has its own architecture. Embers glow in a pattern that looks from above like constellations, remembering what it was to be human. Doorways exhale warmth and inhale stars slow as a held breath. The outer lane grows soft underfoot, as if the ground chooses to forget friction after sunset. People drift along it without deciding to a calm circuit that carries them past thresholds where they are known. Greetings become touch. Touch becomes the certainty that the circle is still whole. Somewhere a sealed door stands spiral dry to the hardness of moonlight. Children walk by without staring a learned mercy. Tomorrow someone will check the ovens for the degree of heat that says readiness. Next week or next year, the ring will lengthen its inhale and then exhale flame with its old discipline. No hurry. Fire is a member of the household. It keeps the same hours. Beyond the ring's edge, the fields wait with a patience that doesn't need witnesses. When the wind is right, you can hear the stalks speak in a language made entirely of agreement. The earth knows what was taught to it by ash and foot and water. Roots follow the old lanes because nutrients remember the gathering. Harvest comes by curve because straight lines forget where hospitality keeps its chair. What the archaeologist will see seasons from now is evidence loom weights, clustered near doorways, a floor redder, where the oven's labour outlived talk a scatter of beads that implies motion rather than loss. What the city sees now is belonging. A day that began with thread and bread, passed through plaza and decision, and returns to thresholds with more warmth than it left. No monument records it. The house itself recorded it in heat, in Polish, in the hush, around a figurine, whose work is to gather attention and then share it. When sleep finally arranges itself, it does so in rings. Family within house, within lane, within settlement within stars. Dreams move along the same curves as footsteps. A child turns once in their bedding, and the whole city feels the correction. Far away, another circle answers in its own time, because webs learn to hum long after their weavers have walked on. If there is wisdom here, it is ordinary enough to be missed. Eat together, face the east, keep the centre generous, let endings be warm. Teach children by alignment, not order. Bend rather than fortify. Burn with precision when you must, for memory, not for spectacle. Carry salt as if it were a soft light. Speak in a geometry that leaves room for the unpredicted good. And if you wake again before dawn, stand at the gate and watch the line of gold discover the first door. It will pass across a floor that knows how to hold it over fingerprints that have agreed to become wall into a room that will one day be ash and then room again. You will understand then that this is not nostalgia. It is instruction from a civilization that learned to stay by practicing how to go. The east brightens, the drum waits, the spindle considers its first turn, the plaza gathers its breath. Another day readies its soft decree, begin as if you have always been beginning. There is a question that keeps circling, why the circle? It returns like a bird that knows the path home without seeing it, a thought that refuses to land until the hand is open. We can say the horizon taught it, the sun rehearsed it, the river encouraged it, but the answer also lives inside the body. Stand in an empty field and spin once with your eyes softened, your arms. Describe the plan before your mind invents it. The circle is not a diagram, it is a posture. Trypillian builders did not draft right angles because their days did not demand them. Straight lines are laws, curves are agreements. A square locks a center and asks who commands. A ring frees a center and asks what is needed. Between those two questions lies a civilization's temperament. Even their tools admit this. The whirl, the quern, the oven mouth, every important gesture turns. Astronomy is often invoked, and rightly. At equinox, the first beam enters a facing pair of doors and crosses the room like a hand that has learned restraint. At solstice morning, skirts the rim of an outer lane with a diffused kindness, as if day itself were stepping softly for a house that sleeps. But the sky is not master here, it is collaborator. The plan converses with light the way old friends do, finishing each other's sentences, without anyone needing credit. If you kneel at dawn in the plaza and watch people arrive, you see how the geometry thinks ahead. Those who rise early from houses near the east-facing gate find themselves first at the emptiness. They sweep. They set vessels to dry. They stand a little while with palms open. Only after the plaza is unlonely do the farther lanes pour their breath into it. The city prevents crowding by beginning with witness. Curves teach the feet to slow. A child who runs too fast in a ring discovers that the body bargains with momentum. Turns become negotiations with self. And in that negotiation lies a social grammar. You cannot barrel through a curve and call it victory. The arc insists on proportion. Elders speak less about rules than about radius. When disagreement arrives, and it must if people are awake, the circle shrinks conflict before words do. Two neighbours walk the outer lane in opposite directions until they meet and are obliged to turn together. By the third bend they share breath. By the fifth, their cadence has synchronized. By the seventh, the quarrel has lost its edges because the path refused to give it corners. A settlement with no angles becomes a school for temper. Even the ovens are teachers. They open toward the room's work, seldom toward thresholds. Seldom toward the north, where cold makes an argument of every breath. Everything in the house leans slightly, as if the room were listening. The upper floor stores the year's patience. The lower holds its needs. Between them runs the stair, a vertical sentence broken into short, respectful clauses. To climb is to learn where to pause. Scholars talk of governance and redistributive labour of schedule and scale, and how a site of 80 hectares prevented itself from becoming a problem. Their papers are careful maps of plausibility, yet the plan itself offers a more tactile answer. It removes places where domination can stand comfortably. A leader in a circle must keep moving, and movement dilutes command into attention. Here influence is a practice, not a station. Children trace spiral motifs with sticks in dust, because the spiral explains the world in a syntax they can hold. The line departs, promises to leave, but returns in a disciplined approach to the same centre without touching it. This is courtesy as geometry. It is how you visit the middle, closely, eagerly, never possessively. Potters bake that lesson into bowls. Dancers write it with feet. The settlement writes it with lanes. From above, the magnetogram shows the plaza as reserved space, not a void, but a vow. Houses point their mouths toward it, the way bodies turn toward warmth. A plaza, without monument, declares that speech matters more than emblem. Whatever ceremony occurred, they're asked light to officiate, and wind to record. No archives survive, but air. Some visitors from later ages might mistake this for absence of ambition. It is a different ambition to perfect recurrence. Not the kind that makes copies, but the kind that makes returns feel newly true. The ring tries a pattern until it sings at a pitch that even birds respect. When the pitch falters, it is not shame, it is key change. We imagine planning meetings and timetables because our minds rest easier on lists than on weather. Yet decisions here likely arrived as thresholds do by widening. If one lane's mouth began to receive more clay than usual, bodies read the need before words were drafted. A burning dew next season announced itself weeks early in how the plaza's dust held footprints, in how sparrows rehearsed a different route, in how bread crust crackled when torn. The figurines explain the circle in miniature. They have no faces because faces argue for centre. They have hips because hips are balance and birth the two everyday miracles that geometry tries to keep ready. Set near a stair, a figurine teaches the body to pivot with grace. Set near an oven, it reminds the hand to adjust heat with patience. Set by a door, it proposes bowing as the beginning of belonging. What of danger you ask of winter teeth and strangers' eyes? A circle is not naive. It chooses its vulnerabilities with intelligence. Gates face the warmth that shows everything. Entrances are many because scarcity loves choke points more than community does. If threat learned to read the plan, it discovered that nothing it desired stood alone. Every jar lived in chorus. Every tool knew two different shelves. Every skill had already trained a cousin. The ring's ethics extend to time. A house readying for fire teaches all other houses how to hold their warmth with dignity. Children are not frightened because they have been apprenticed to endings since their first steps. Elders do not hoard because they have been promoted to ash before death, their advice mixed into daub by choice. What remains after flame is not emptiness but a flaw more certain of itself. If you were to design a grammar from scratch and ask it to produce cooperation without the help of titles, you might end up with something like this. Begin all sentences with east. Keep nouns round and close together. Avoid sharp adjectives unless carving meat. Let verbs proceed by curve. End clauses with breath. Permit ellipses where fire will arrive later. Never use exclamation where a bowl will do. On some evenings, a pale wind moves along the lanes as if remembering the day in order. It touches the door frames, the smooth posts, the low eaves, as a hand touches a sleeping child deliberately not to wake, but to confirm. This is not superstition. It is audit. The plan checks itself for roughness and corrects by morning. When the circle slows into old age, it does not clutch. Paths green over in the right places first. A gate forgets to keep widening and decides to be a path again. The plaza starts holding more sky than voices. No decrees, no ruins for spectacle. Just the polite dispersal of usefulness into soil. Seed finds easier purchase upon a red floor. Roots follow old thresholds in confidence. A new plant learns from an old wall how to stand. Elsewhere in Europe, stones begin to rise a different answer to the same questions. Trypillian wisdom migrates not as blueprint, but as temperament. A preference for circles, a respect for openings, an affection for alignment. Where later ages carve eternity into megaliths, the memory of clay lingers inside their orbits, like breath you cannot see. The plaza's humility becomes an avenue of sun. The empty center becomes a chamber for solstice. The language changes medium. The grammar stays legible. If you listen late at night to the fields that now cover these plans, you hear a low patient meter, crickets win the far soft percussion of a river naming its stones. The sound is circular. It repeats without tiring, not because it forgets, but because it remembers so well that repetition is simply fidelity. A city that taught itself to end with warmth has earned that kind of echo. So why the circle? Because the world is round enough to deserve likeness. Because breath is round enough to be a teacher. Because communities that choose return over possession survive themselves with grace. Because a center can be most powerful when it stays empty. And because the East arriving each morning without argument draws a line no ruler can improve. Tomorrow we will walk another ring, this one, barely visible under meadow and weather. We will begin at its polite widening. Let the light thread us inward and stand again in the generosity that never learns to be bored. If the ground is cool, place your palm upon it and listen. For the answer. It gives every question. The answer that never changes and never repeats. Begin breathe. Turn. Morning after rain, the plain shines like memory polished by water. Drops gather in shallow hollows where walls once stood, each a mirror the size of a palm. If you lean close enough, you will see the clouds moving backward, the sky rehearsing what it looked like 5,000 years ago. It is here, in this wet hush, that the archaeologists return every spring. Their boots write temporary alphabets across the same soil that once wrote in fire. Every mark they make is a translation, every trench an attempt to learn the grammar of patience. A team works near the plaza, their strings staked in tidy squares that the old city never asked for. They scrape, they sift, they pause for the wind to move dust aside, and sometimes in the exact place where nothing was expected, a sound interrupts the ordinary. The faint chime of metal brushing stone, the quick intake of breath, a fragment rising from the earth like a remembered word. It might be a pot rim, red and white, still trembling in its pigments. It might be the curve of a figurine's hip, smooth as a sigh. It might be a piece of daub fingerprints fossilized on its surface, a handshake offered across 5,000 years of silence. When found, each piece is measured, drawn, photographed, then placed gently into darkness again. A box, a wrapping another kind of sleep. Even resurrection must respect rest. One afternoon, while rain threatens again, an archaeologist named Irina clears the floor of what was once a house. Her trowel skims the earth's skin with the same rhythm that fire once used. She finds the floor red as a wound that has chosen healing. At its center lies a faint circle of ash, and in that circle, a small stone blade, its edge still impossibly sharp. It is not where it should be. Blades belong to thresholds or to hearths, not here in the middle of nothing. She sits back on her heels and lets the rain fall. Maybe the blade was left as an ending, maybe as a warning, or maybe simply as gratitude for a life that required no inscription. she leaves it in place. Some stories remain truer when unlifted. Later that night, the field tents flicker with lamplight. The team eats quietly steam rising from enamel bowls. Outside, frogs resume their measured applause. Someone plays a soft tune on a mouth harp, its thin metallic pulse slipping between conversation. It sounds uncannily like the map itself, those bright magnetized rings singing in monochrome, the same rhythm transferred from soil to air. Irina opens her notebook. She writes nothing about discovery, only a single sentence. The earth still dreams in circles. She closes the page. The lamp trembles as wind brushes the canvas. For a moment, everything around her Rainier, the quiet inside her ribs, feels aligned. At dawn, the mist is thick enough to erase the horizon. For an instant, the world looks exactly as it must have looked when the first builders arrived. The same hills, the same rivers still rehearsing their bends, the same invitation written in emptiness. In this fog, you could believe the city still stands. Every bird call is a door creaking. Every gust is a roof sighing back to life. The magnetogram's ghost overlaps the landscape. You can almost see the rings glowing faintly under the grass, white fire sleeping beneath green breath. Some mornings the archaeologists lose the line between then and now. A boot print beside an ancient threshold looks too fresh, and for a heartbeat the mind misreads it as company. You half expect to hear voices, a child calling for water, a pot struck for tone, a laugh muffled behind woven reed walls. Then wind clears the illusion and leaves only birds, but the sound is enough. In the distance, a tractor hums. The field once holy is practical again. The rhythm of planting overlays the rhythm of burning. Modern furrows follow the old lanes out of habit. Farmers don't know the names of the cities beneath their wheels, but their hands remember the curvature, and their seeds fall exactly where fire once fell. Continuity disguised as agriculture. By midday, the sun dries the last of the puddles, and the plain becomes mirrorless once more. But underground in the cool, half-dark Trypillia is still turning not in motion, but in meaning. The old walls, the vitrified floors, the sealed doors, each layer of ash stacked like a library of lessons. How to build gently, how to share center, how to let go with warmth. Irina stands at the eastern edge of the site. The wind presses her jacket to her skin. The horizon breathes in the same tone it always has. She closes her eyes, and in that simple darkness, she feels the faintest tremor, a rhythm beneath her boots. A pulse not of machines, but of memory. Maybe it's her imagination. Maybe it's the echo of the river underground. Or maybe it's the city itself breathing in the same patient tempo it always knew. If you stand there long enough, you'll feel it too. The air thickens slightly, the ground exhales warmth. And if you place your palm flat on the soil, you'll know what the old builders knew, that civilization is not measured by height, but by the tenderness of what it leaves behind. Above the clouds part, the sun lays a long, gentle line toward the east, as if the earth were opening its gate once more. By late summer, the steppe becomes a soft sea of colour. Ochre grasses, violet thistles, the silver of river willows. The horizon blurs where land and light decide not to argue. It is easy to imagine in that shimmer that the Trypillians never left, only shifted one breath further into invisibility. Everywhere you walk, the ground carries their residues. Here a scatter of burnt clay that still remembers a wall. There a line of darker soil, once a lane of feet. To the trained eye, the pattern emerges, circles nesting within circles, each settlement a ripple of another's echo. But the beauty of it lies in the way these traces do not compete. Each ring respects the ghost of its predecessor. The earth layers them as care layers a story, each retelling, softening the edges. Somewhere near the river's bend, another excavation opens. The air smells of wet grain and iron, a scent that belongs equally to archaeology and to prayer. The diggers work with brushes now, not trowels. They have reached the level where the fire once stopped itself. Each flick of the bristles reveals a patch of red floor, a surface so smooth it seems to pulse. One of them whispers, "It's like touching a heartbeat frozen in clay." A few centimeters deeper, they find something stranger. Two figurines back to back, fused by melting their surfaces, glistening as if they had tried to save each other. No faces, only the memory of shoulders, the curve of listening in both. The archaeologists do not separate them. They clean the soil around the pair until the outline looks like a seed. Then they cover it again. Some artifacts prefer rest to interpretation. In the afternoons, the plain is full of murmurs, the hum of bees around late flowers, the rhythmic sigh of scythes where hay still matters, the far percussion of thunder that never quite arrives. These are the same sounds that must have threaded through the city when it was alive, ordinary music, the kind that survives catastrophe because it has nothing to prove. At dusk, the team gathers at the edge of their trenches. They watch the sun slide into the Dnister's slow current, and the reflection bends itself into a perfect ring. It happens every evening, but still someone gasps. The circle never stops being an astonishment. Later they return to camp. The generator coughs once and yields to night. Lanterns bloom under the canvas like tame stars. Someone reads aloud from a notebook, a line from an ancient letter written long after Trypillia's silence by a Greek who tried to name a river that refused to be named. He wrote, "The people who lived before us built as if they were remembering something the rest of us forgot." The voice reading it falters not from fatigue, but from recognition. Everyone looks out to where the plain dissolves into dark. There are nights when mist rolls in so thick that sound bends. You can hear the water's movement as though it were walking closer. Frogs sing at intervals that almost match a human heartbeat. The wind plays with the grass until it sounds like distant footsteps. And then, in that blur of night, and maybe you feel the circle stir. Not a haunting, not an apparition, just a sense that the ground is remembering how to breathe. You could call it echo, but it feels more like courtesy, the past answering softly to let you know it is still keeping its promises. Some say that when the wind is right, you can hear low chanting from the direction of Nebelivka, a kind of vowel-less hum. Others say it is only the reeds moving, but the sound is too organized, too patient to be accident. It rises, falls, rises again, as if an entire settlement were still practicing the art of becoming light. In those moments, time feels porous. The camps of the present and the cities of the past share the same breath. The archaeologists fall silent, their hands resting on knees, their bodies warmed by the same invisible fire that once taught clay how to remember. They know it will not last. The sound will dissolve with the first gust of colder air. The night will decide to be only night again. But for a heartbeat, the circle and the living coincide. Toward midnight, rain begins. Drops fall into the open trenches, turning dust into small patient pools. Each drop finds a place to rest, and in that rest, the old city writes again, not in pigment, not in flame, but in water. By morning, the site will glisten, and the red floors will hide beneath new mud. The archaeologists will pack their notebooks, fold their tents, carry their questions back to towns built of straight lines and clocks. They will tell stories of their work of data and stratigraphy and radiocarbon, and all of it will be true, but none of it will describe the feeling of that low hum, the moment when earth and memory shared a language without sound. Years from now, when another team returns, the grass will have grown thicker, the soil softer, the wind more practiced in its whisper. But if they listen closely, they will hear the same pulse. They will mark the same curves. And they will understand, even without saying it aloud, that the circle never left. We simply forgot how to walk its perimeter with respect. So, when you stand on the plain and the air is still enough place your hand on the ground, you will feel a faint vibration, the echo of thousands of feet walking toward an invisible center. That center is not a place. It is an idea the earth keeps repeating. Build with care. End with grace. Leave space for the wind. The horizon brightens. A thin band of rose stretches across the east. Somewhere unseen, the Trypillian cities burn again, not in ruin, but in light. A ring this large eats gently, or it cannot eat at all. The arithmetic of a megasite is not written with numbers, but with breathwood water, clay grain, all moving at a pace the body can keep without hardening. From the Dniester's hush to the willow belts that line its banks, the city learns how to ask without stripping. Morning begins with distance measured in carry, how far a shoulder can bear a jar before the arm asks for a pause. How a yoke distributes weight so that even tiredness cooperates. Wood is the first negotiation. To burn a house into teaching requires fuel, but not the kind that empties a horizon. They cut from the places that forgive river coppice scrub oak that returns as if instructed fallen limbs, gathered after wind has said please. Bundles arrive along the outer lane, like low brown planets, each tied with last year's stalks. Children learn bark by taste, willow sour poplar, mild oak, stubborn as dusk. The city keeps a memory of heat, not a pile, but a circulation fuel, moving where ovens inhale most steadily, never hoarded into suspicion. Clay is the second contract. It waits in hollows slick as thought-patient as a vow. Some of it is lifted on litters. Some is thickened in baskets that leak water perfectly. Some rests in pits beside houses until temper and will agree. Hands fold straw and dung into the mix, giving clay a memory of field and animal, so that when fire arrives, the wall will not forget who it belongs to. Every palm print pressed into daub is a receipt shared with weather. Water is the third kindness. At dawn, girls and boys walk the long curve to the river, their jars knocking a rhythm against hips that learn to carry future days. They do not make lines. Lines bruise. They arrive in braided time voices placed between flows so that the bank stays generous. Along the path, low basins gather the splash from lids, tiny reserves for later evidence that thrift and grace have never been strangers. Grain is the settlement's pulse. Fields arrange themselves like ideas around a good question, close enough for feet, far enough to let soil forget a little before asking again. Ridges take barley. Flats take emmer and einkorn. The patient margins hold flax that teaches hands to separate strength from softness. At harvest, sickles work in polite crescents cruise, moving as rings within the ring, leaving stubble like a script the wind can read. Sheaves travel inward on backs and sleds. Threshing follows the curve of shade. Chaff rises and returns as the ring's quiet weather. Waste is not an accusation here. It is a chorus. Ash becomes advice for fields that argue with water. Shards line thresholds where mud insists. Broken quernstone supports a post that repays the favour by staying plumb. Even what no longer works finds a place to teach. There are no middens loud with indifference, only soft accumulations that remember their prior voice. How do thousands eat without shouting? The plaza breathes the answer distribution by presence. At first light, a family sets a pot near the centre with a spiral that tells where the contents came from. Another brings salt in a loaf impressed with the same sign. A runner arrives from Majdaneckie with news of clay ready for sharing. A cousin from Taljanki ties a red cloth to a stick to say that ovens on the west lane are resting and can spare warmth to the east. No tally is spoken. When the sun stands on a certain roofline, someone lifts a flute, and that is the hour for returning favours. Governance proceeds by cue, not command. The hinterland is not a back. It is the city's other hand. Bee pasture is tended the way plazas are swept. Springs are given edges of stone, the way thresholds receive polish. Fallow is treated as a citizen who has earned a season of silence. From the willow marshes comes weaving. From the oak edge come tools. From the meadow come dyes with names like wind and bruise and dawn. A settlement that refuses walls must be expert in invitation, not only to people, but to growth. Even the burn that closes a house respects the balance. Fuel is gathered over seasons, so the forest never feels the theft as crisis. A year with thin wood asks for thinner flame and a longer ceremony. Walls taught to redden slowly, ceiling to fall with courtesy embers, spread like a rumour of warmth rather than a shout. The ring's genius is not power, it is adjustment. Every plan admits correction, shaped like a curve. Logistics look like ritual, because repetition is the only honest technology here. A woman who has carried water for 30 winters walks a path that has smoothed to her stride. The path remembers and eases her. A boy who has stacked willow for 10 springs can tell by palm alone which branch will split well when asked by flame. Expertise is stored not in thresholds or tablets, but in bodies and lanes. When those bodies age, the knowledge does not thin. It paces itself along the ring diffused by watching. Trade keeps the edges awake. Salt from Poianus Latinae enters the circle like a small moon. Obsidian from far Carpathian veins arrives as night disciplined into edge. What leaves in return is not just pottery, but manner a way of holding jars of opening doors to the east of letting the centre remain unfinished. The network is a school disguised as distance. Neighbours separated by days agree to the same cue of dawn. What of numbers? An accountant would find them if asked baskets counted by shadows, jars by shelf loaves, by song. But counting never becomes a tyrant. When scarcity hints, the plaza tightens its inhale without being told. Festivals lean to plainer music. Processions shorten. The burn waits for weather that will help rather than harm. The mathematics of the ring runs on affection before it takes help from measure. There are tasks that reveal the city's hidden hydraulics. After a night of rain, children drag small rakes along the outer lane to persuade puddles into channels that lead away from thresholds and toward thirsty elder trees. The act looks like play. It is engineering with manners. At the equinox, elders press palms to certain floor spots to feel whether heat is moving kindly beneath a haptic audit of last season's fires. If a room answers with uneven warmth, a new vent is opened with a shard and a prayer that is mostly instruction. Nothing here is centralized except attention. A sealed door gathers it. A new kiln attracts it. A childbirth pulls it tight until the cry becomes singing. Authority is a current that loops in the open. Stand still long enough in the plaza, and it will pass through you. Ask a small task. Bless your hands. Move on. By evening, the city's accounts are balanced in appetite rather than ink. If there is extra bread, it finds the old. If there is extra silence, it finds the tired. If there is extra heat, it finds the jar whose glaze asks to be born. A ring this large survives not by storage alone, but by the mercy of timely dispersal. Too much in one place becomes fear. Enough everywhere becomes sleep. Walk out with the last light along the path that leans toward Nebelivka. On your left, coppiced willow shows its green stubble of promise. On your right, stubble fields host birds correcting insects into moderation. Underfoot, clay remembers which feet love it. Ahead, a gate widens, not to command but to forgive. The sky performs its old arithmetic, a thin blade of gold along the east already rehearsing tomorrow, and you understand why the ring keeps choosing to begin again. Logistics are only the shape devotion takes when it refuses to turn into law. In the half-dark, someone sets a jar by a sealed door. Inside it, a handful of salt, a curl of willow, a shard pressed with a spiral, fuel structure memory. The city's ledgers written in the only ink that does not stain the consent to return. Tonight, the jar will glow as the moon discovers it. Tomorrow, a child will carry it to the plaza. Next season, those same ingredients will appear transformed in bread, in roof, in story. And so a megasite breathes not by miracle, but by manners kept exact. Wood taught to regrow by patience, clay taught to hold by kindness, water taught to arrive on time by path, fire taught to leave gifts, thousands of people taught to mean yes by walking in curves. The ring is not mystery, and yet it is because coordination that does not bruise feels improbable until you stand inside it and find your breath matching what the ground has practiced for centuries. If you listen now, you will hear only crickets and the soft applause of river on its stones. If you return at dawn, you will hear the city count without counting a bucket. Set down a spindle's first turn, an oven clearing its throat, a loaf answering. The day's ledger will close with the same 2 entries. It always carries warmth dispensed room left, and the settlement will sleep solvent in the only currency that matters, a centre still empty enough for everyone. To speak of Trypillia is to speak of time, unhurried time that folds instead of flowing. Most civilizations race, this one turns. Its memory moves, not as chronology, but as pulse repeating in slow, deliberate waves that teach patience even to stone. Archaeologists divide it into phases A, B, C, as though life could be alphabetized. But between those letters lie centuries of silence, where change meant not replacement, but refinement. A jar made thinner, a flaw, fired longer, a burn postponed until weather stopped trembling. What endures is not the sequence of years, but the texture of recurrence. Across the generations, the circle adjusted like a breathing organism. Early rings hugged the hills shy and small. Later ones unrolled themselves onto the plain, confident, deliberate, their streets wide enough for songs to pass each other without collision. Some stretched for miles, houses arrayed in perfect arcs, as if the builders had learned to read horizon the way others read scripture. No fortifications, no palaces, only rhythm, the same rhythm you hear now in wind brushing through barley. We call this the late period. But that is only a name. It did not know it was late. It was simply the moment when skill and humility achieved equilibrium, when clay could be trusted to hold without defiance and fire could be invited without fear. The colours of pottery softened ochre leaned toward rose black, toward the tender blue of a storm's edge. Even the spirals changed character, less symmetrical, more fluent, as though the hand had stopped copying and started conversing. At Nebelivka, the largest of them, all the city stretched wider than Paris will one day stretch. Over 10,000 souls, their houses ringing an open centre larger than a cathedral floor. In the soil magnetometers still whisper the pattern lines of fire-dimmed clay, forming a design so precise it feels intentional even now. But what amazes the excavators most is the absence of domination. No great hall, no single shrine, no residence that dares to call itself more permanent than another. Just the repetition of dignity multiplied by patience. Imagine walking its lanes in late autumn. Smoke rising straight into a cold sky. Dogs weaving between feet, the smell of grain drying on racks. 100 small ovens pulsing like stars preparing to disappear. Somewhere, a voice hums the low refrain that marks the turning of the year. A tone meant less for ears than for the bones of the ground. Everywhere, hints of preparation. Houses mended too neatly. Floors patched with care, a little too ceremonial. Children watching adults as if memorizing choreography. The final burn approaches not with dread, but with composure. The settlement will not be erased by violence or accident. It will bow out by design. A civilization rehearsing its own conclusion. When the time comes, They will close the doors, offer grain, let fire remember its old promise. Then they will walk eastward, not fleeing, not mourning, simply continuing carrying the geometry inside them. Some will settle again a few valleys over. Some will drift toward the Carpathians where copper begins to glow in the veins of rock. Others will move toward the Danube, teaching strangers how to align their homes with dawn. The circle once drawn in earth begins to migrate in minds. It becomes a thought carried in the bones of those who refuse to forget how generosity feels. Centuries later, when these people's descendants raise the first stones of Europe's temples, the curve returns in the round walls of Malta, in the megalithic rings of Brittany, in the passage graves that open only when the sun and the world agree on angle. The lineage of circles continues quiet but unbroken, a heritage of alignment rather than conquest. Historians will argue whether Trypillia influenced them. They will weigh potsherds and DNA, calculate migrations and climate swings, debate whether such vast settlements could vanish without burial mounds or war. But the earth itself seems to answer in gentler terms. It offers patterns too consistent to be coincidence, too patient to be proof. It whispers not inheritance, but resonance, a song remembered by soil. The last traces of Trypillia fade around 3000 BCE. No massacre, no drought carved in desperation, just dispersal. A long exhale. Ash turned to soil turned to field turned to memory. The people folded themselves into the landscape until no border could find them. They did not vanish. They succeeded in becoming ordinary. Perhaps that is the highest civilization can reach, to dissolve so seamlessly into the rhythm of the earth that its disappearance feels like continuity. Now when satellites scan the plains, they see those concentric ghosts glowing under harvests. The old streets still trace their breath beneath wheat and sunflower, the geometry of coexistence waiting patiently for us to remember it again. If you walk there today on a still evening when the air smells of ash and rain, you might notice how the wind moves in arcs, how the fields seem to breathe with quiet symmetry, how the horizon curls softly back upon itself. You might even hear the faint percussion of fire not burning but teaching. The past does not vanish. It adjusts its frequency until someone learns to listen. And when we do, we find that the circle never promised eternity, only return. To build gently, to end gently, to begin again. Always begin again. Sometimes the only way to see the living is through the dead. Trypillia has left us no faces, no names, no single tombs to whisper lineage. Its people pass through time as water passes through fingers, leaving coolness, not evidence. Yet in their absence, they built a presence large enough to outlast pride. Beneath the wheat of Ukraine and Moldova, under the rivers that have changed their course, but not their patience, the old red floors still wait. They hold the weight of our modern questions with the same composure they once held fire. Who were you builders of circles that chose to end? Why did you trust burning more than stone? Why did you leave no monument, only a rhythm too large for empire and too soft for memory? The archaeologists kneel where those questions hum the loudest. They measure the magnetism of ash, the tilt of shards, the pollen of crops that forgot how to grow elsewhere. They write reports that glow with precision. Kilns, querns, pigments, domestic economies, and yet every line is haunted by a silence the data cannot graph. For what they seek is not proof, but pulse. Each artifact, when lifted, becomes an interruption in time, a bead the size of a breath, a spindle whirl worn to translucence, a child's footprint pressed into the baked floor of a vanished house. When the light hits them right, they seem to shine inward. You realize then that the Trypillian gift was not invention, but orientation, an insistence that everything return toward warmth. The museum cases cannot contain that warmth. They hold it like glass, holds breath beautifully, but only for a moment. Visitors walk by the vitrines, whispering names they cannot pronounce, and yet their eyes soften. Something about the spiral, the curve, the colour of the clay, it asks to be remembered by the body, not the mind. In Kiev, one display shows the model of a house reconstructed from ash, 2 levels an oven, like a heartbeat walls painted in ochre and cream. School children stare at it as though waiting for smoke to rise. The guide says, they burned their homes every generation, and the children blink not in disbelief, but in recognition. They have seen forests burn and return. They know cycles are not always punishment. The Trypillian way still hides in gestures the round table the bread passed sunwise, the small bow given before stepping through a door. Echoes in manners so familiar we stop noticing. Even in cities of glass and hurry, there are plazas that remember how to curve, how to centre nothing but sky. Perhaps the old cities have not vanished. They have simply changed materials. Clay became concrete. Reed became wire fire, became current. We built higher, but not wiser. We worshipped the straight line again, and in doing so, we forgot the art of leaving space. The earth endures our geometry, but keeps its own beneath, waiting for the moment when we remember softness. A satellite passing above the Dniester still sees the rings glowing faintly at night, not from light, but from contrast moisture held differently where human heat once taught the ground to breathe. In dry years, the pattern appears clearer, as if absence itself wanted to speak. Farmers say their wheat grows taller there. Archaeologists smile politely, but the truth is harder. The soil remembers kindness. Where clay was mixed with patience, roots find hospitality. Where ash was given freely, life comes easier. To stand on one of those buried rings is to feel something very close to forgiveness. The ground no longer holds edges. It only holds invitation. The breeze moves circularly, as if tracing old lanes. Insects orbit your legs like lost citizens recognizing a returning season. Even silence behaves as if rehearsed. If you kneel, you can smell faint sweetness, not of rot, but of warmth stored too long. Close your eyes, and you will hear the faint roll of a quernstone, the hiss of chaff, a child's song, rising with smoke. The city is not gone. It is breathing through you. Perhaps this was their intention, to teach us that civilization is not walls, not rule, not name, but a discipline of gentleness. To show that power can choose to dissolve, and in dissolving, remain. At dusk, clouds drift east, heavy with gold. The light gathers in the grass, as though the earth itself were remembering how to burn. You walk the field, careful not to step too hard, and every few steps the ground gives slightly soft hollow, the signature of an old oven below. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the Dniester loops its water, whispering the same phrase it has whispered for millennia. Turn, turn, return. And you understand at last that the Trypillians did not disappear. They became the rhythm of the land. They became the slow intelligence of fire. They became the way dawn still finds the east, and how night forgives the day for ending. They became the circle itself, the gentlest shape that time has ever learned to make. The plain sleeps again. Grass folds over what was once the largest city on earth. And the wind that long archivist slides its fingers through centuries of silence. The Trypillian rings lie beneath not ruins, but instructions written in the patient language of ash. Above the world has become noise. Engines' lights, hunger for height. The straight line has won. For now roads walls ambitions. Yet beneath that grid, the old geometry still breathes a steady pulse under the skin of modern fields. At night when satellites pass, the shapes shimmer faintly in infrared perfect concentric traces of a people, who believed in return more than arrival. From space, they look like ripples from a single stone thrown into eternity. We call them settlements, but what they truly were are meditations in clay. If you could see the Trypillians now, not as ghosts, but as rhythm, you would recognize them everywhere. In the way a crowd curves instinctively to make room for another, in the round bread shared at a table, in the instinct to face east, when beginning something new, the circle persists because it never demands memory. It only offers balance. A farmer bends at dawn to touch the soil and feels a warmth he cannot name. He plants in arcs though no one told him to. His daughter sketches spirals in dust while waiting for the sun. His mother hums an old tune that has no words, but keeps perfect time with the quern's slow spin. They do not know that their bodies are repeating an architecture. They only know it feels right. Perhaps that is what legacy means when spoken softly, not inheritance, but intuition. The pulse of ancestors felt, not studied. Their instructions travelling invisibly in breath and habit, carried by generations who never learned their names. Everywhere you look, the evidence glows. The temples of Malta still curve like the shoulders of the figurines. The henges of England still open to the east. Even in modern cathedrals, the nave and dome meet in the oldest geometry, an upward circle folded into faith. We keep reinventing what the plane once knew, that the sacred begins in the act of rounding space. Trypillia was never meant to last as a monument. Its greatness was its refusal to be captured. The people built, burned and built again each generation, practicing the art of letting go. In doing so, they achieved what empire cannot: continuity without possession. Imagine it now, the final evening before the final fire. The city quiet ovens, banked low air, trembling with the scent of flax and smoke, children asleep beside sealed jars, elders tracing spirals on the packed floor, their fingers leaving no mark the eye can see. Then a single spark, small, almost accidental. The light spreads, and the walls answer in colour red gold, a sigh of white as clay turns to glass. The city glows without screaming. It exhales itself into the dark, and in that exhalation, civilization learns its most merciful gesture, the will to return quietly into the earth that taught it shape. Centuries pass, the ashes settle, grasses root, rivers turn, and the sky patient and unsentimental keeps facing east. When modern feet cross these fields, they step upon a library, written in temperature and wind. If you listen, you can hear the syllables forming. Build gently, speak softly, end with grace. One evening, long after the archaeologists have left, rain begins. Not hard, just steady, each drop a finger pressing the soil's memory awake. A faint circle of steam rises where a house once stood, a last gesture of warmth returning home. For a few breaths the field glows as if the city has decided to dream again. Then the light fades. The grass recloses. Silence gathers, not empty, but full. Somewhere in that silence, the Trypillians continue their work, burning without harm, teaching without voice, living without name. And if you stand there long enough, you will feel it, a tremor that has nothing to do with wind or heartbeat. A quiet reminder that beneath every step lies an old generosity, waiting for the world to remember how to move in circles once more. So let us end as they began, not with answers, but with alignment. Face east, breathe, and listen for the sound of fire remembering itself